301, Cruise. Just as I was about to zone out and brainstorm about how I could ruin the hive mind's day without using my psychic powers, the gorgeous bundle in my lap spoke up, dragging me back into the here and now. So what's the plan? Celine asked, looking perfectly content using me as her rightful throne and not showing even a hint of an intention to move. Orbital bombardment, I said with a shrug. I'm going to set my mind cores to developing some better orbital missiles. It seems like I'd overlooked that capability so far, so this looks like the prime time to fill it and make it the Tyrannid's problem. As we talked, I felt another warp blast slam into the barrier, but I was now conscious and in control. I reinforced the section about to be struck, then set my colossal processing capabilities upon the tidal wave of incoming data. In a bit, I'd have a thorough analysis of what aspects of my barrier were getting the most stress, and then I'd selectively reinforce those some more. A few more hits and the Sovereign wouldn't even feel those psychic blasts anymore. I can adapt too, and much better than you, stupid intergalactic eldritch horror. I'm gonna fuck you up. Was I angry? Oh, I was furious deep down, but fear was the primary emotion roiling in my gut. Something had gotten to me again, and I had to be lent a hand by Jurgen, of all people. Ugh. How long would it have taken me otherwise to get some semblance of control back? Would I ever have managed? Would the warp blasts have eventually broken through? The scenario played out in my mind, the barriers falling, the psychic scream reaching Celine and my guests, fracturing their minds with an ungodly amount of agony no human could ever endure, slamming into their minds. I was cheating with my ridiculously powerful soul, they couldn't. Would I ever have been able to rebuild Celine's mind? Would she ever have been the same? Would I ever have been the same after failing her like that? This horrible, grimdark galaxy is trying to drag me down to its level again and make me as miserable as the rest of its inhabitants. I took a deep, shuddering breath and pulled Celine in for a crushing hug, receiving only a small squeak before she melted into the embrace and returned it. We are fine, you did good, she whispered into my ear, soothingly running her fingers through my hair. I am fine, you are fine, we are both fine. You protected us. It's okay, everything is okay. Gods, I love her so much. With just a few simple words and whispered sweet nothings, she drained the majority of my stress and anxiety right out of my body, leaving me with a happy, fluttery emotion in my heart. I don't deserve this, Angel. You do, Celine whispered firmly, arms tightening around me. She pulled back, steel gray eyes glaring into my own. Ah, did I think that too loudly? You deserve to be happy, you are the best thing that's ever happened to me, and the same goes to all the people whose lives you made better. I slumped, just enjoying the moment as I melted into her arms, burying my face in the crook of her neck. My mind cores were working overtime, and I was making subconscious adjustments to the barriers based on their findings, so I could allow myself this moment. I love you, you know that, Celine's voice poured into my mind, followed by the accompanying fluffy, delightful emotions. I love you too, I whispered, my voice muffled a little. I was afraid that if I used telepathy now, I'd let a bit too much of my emotion slip through, and she'd get overwhelmed, so regular old primitive vocal communication it was. Another warp blast slammed into the ship while we were talking, but instead of rocking it and throwing everyone on their asses, all it did was send a small rumble of discontent through the colossal ship. I got work to do, I sighed, giving my lover a squeeze, but before I could say any more, she leaned forward and captured my lips. I was startled, but returned it after a moment with much enthusiasm. It was a gentle, slow thing filled with emotion, and I could practically feel Celine pour her affections for me into it, communicating it all through her lips. The silly girl didn't know that this only made me even more terrified of losing all this. I could never let that happen. Celine pulled away, a pleased smile on her lips as she huddled in, her head resting on my shoulder, apparently unwilling to stop using me as her rightful throne. Oh well, I could live with this. I could totally live with this. I'm going to obliterate those fucking Tyranids while cuddling with this little minx of mine. Was there anything more disrespectful than that? I started with the tried and true method of planetary annihilation, orbital bombardment. My missiles were designed for void combat, but I was sure I'd have ample opportunity to collect more than enough data to refine a variant optimal for orbital bombardment for each type of torpedo I had in the very near future. 1,000,000 small holes less than a meter across opened up on the belly of the ship, and a volley of missiles shot out of them, for subsequent waves of them, before the barrier slammed shut again just in time to negate yet another colossal warp blast. The missiles raced towards the surface, spreading out to cover a stretch of land the size of North America. Plasma bombs, acid bombs, pyroacid bombs, toxic bombs, base bombs. I wasn't holding anything back, thousands of each kind were falling upon the planet like rain. Some burst midair as artillery bioforms unleashed their wrath on the hail of death, some more detonated when aerial bioforms flew into their path, but 4/5 struck true. The Sovereign started its slow approach, swimming towards the north pole of the planet. If I could blow that stupid structure still screaming into my mind to hell, I'd be able to leverage my psychic powers again. I just had to disrupt it enough to stop it from working. Everything died in the stretch of land my orbital bombardment landed on. Some of the tougher beasties survived the first volley, but then came the next 3, and I made sure to divert at least a handful of missiles to every tyrannid that somehow survived the first blow. Maybe they were carnifexes with more luck than the rest, a lictor that managed to hide behind cover at the edges of 2 explosions, a biotitan that was just built differently. Even the luckiest ones didn't survive unscathed and fell when they came under concentrated fire. Overwhelming firepower, take that. I might not have any trump cards using solely my eldritch powers, powerful enough to contest some of my more ridiculous psychic tricks, but there was a quality in overwhelming quantity, too. And would you look at that? My bioenergy reserves were at an all-time high. Those 4 volleys cost me barely a fraction of a percentage of my total reserves. The demons were doing something too, but I'd made sure that the warp rift was on the other side of the planet, so I'd just keep an eye on it for now. I didn't feel like dealing with that while unable to use most of my psychic powers. I need to build in safeguards. A teleportation spell tied to a whitestone pylon? Could I even anchor a more active spell like that to whitestone? Maybe I could make a teleportation beacon sort of thing out of whitestone and another trinket with a recall function. I didn't know how I'd make sure it could be operated even if I was, for some reason, unable to use my psychic powers entirely, or I was otherwise in no state to even focus on activating it. I would need to think some more about it and experiment even more than that afterwards, but it was a worthwhile endeavor. I didn't like the thought of having no routes of escape. I twitched in annoyance when I sensed my regular murderous playmate emerge into the materium on the other side of the planet and announce his existence. The roar carried far, rippling through the immaterium and reaching the ears of everyone with even just a little psychic potential. What was that? Kane asked, then took a hasty step toward Jurgen. His face blanched, and he started breathing through his nose, but he looked determined to be within hugging distance of his aide. Smart. He had been the one to shove Jurgen at me when I was having a seizure too. Damn it, I'm going to have to reward them for that. Let it not be said that I'm a miserly bitch who can't recognize a favor owed. Doombreed, I said, scrunching up my nose. Nosy fucker can't just wait for his turn at getting his ass hooped. On another note, I owe you a favor for your aids, help. What is it you truly desire? He blinked slowly, then answered in a bit of a daze. Safety. I can do that, I said, my lips peeling back into a toothy grin. What do you say about a total genetic and biological makeover? I will make you into a custodian, just a regular human-sized one. Unaging body, perfect memory, strength, toughness, endurance, intelligence, agility, and reflexes eclipsing that of an Astartes. I could even weave in something a little extra, granting you a healing factor derived from Primarch Fulgrim's uncorrupted genetic template. Did you know he once survived getting shot in the head by a Vindicare's sniper rifle? Or if you want safety in the more abstract sense, I can give you a private mansion on Valia. Anything that wants to reach you there would have to go through the defenses I've erected to protect the heart of my little empire. Huh, he said intelligently, staring at me as if I'd just grown a second head, launching the next volley. Same yield, upgraded template, same numbers, optimized flight patterns and target selection algorithms, and I snorted. Will he get dissected by a Muggos biologus after getting convicted of super heresy by an inquisitorial conclave if I actually do that? I asked, turning my gaze on Amberly. Not if it's endorsed by Lord Octavian, Amberly said after a few seconds of careful consideration, looking miffed. Officially endorsed. It would also help if it were known that you used the same. Archaeotech was the emperor when he made the Primarchs. Some would still consider it extremely heretical, however. None can ever meddle with the Omnissiah's own work. To even think you can ever improve it is the height of hubris, and super tech heresy besides, and all that bullcrap? I rolled my eyes. Stupid cultists. Did you know that the Emperor planned to dismantle the cult Mechanicus after the Great Crusade? He absolutely loathed religion, and he was a scientist himself, perhaps the greatest scientist humanity ever knew. I think that's why he kept Kelbier Hal as Fabricator General. He wanted them to overreach and give him a reason to go to war after the Treaty of Mars. My analytical mind cores and my ethereal political instincts all agreed with me on that. Biggie had plans upon plans for the future, a dynamic step-by-step master plan that would have seen his vision for humanity realized. A psychic race of humanity, free from the threat of chaos and ruling the galaxy in perpetuity in a semi-democratic state. Everything he did during the Great Crusade had been temporary, just meant to hold his empire together until he finished the Webway project and could turn his attention to nation building. Then the Horus Heresy happened, then Magnus happened to his Webway project, the Schism of Mars happened when he wasn't ready for a war with them yet, and then he ended up as a desiccated corpse acting as an eldritch battery while his patchwork mess of an empire that was meant to be a temporary thing evolved outside his control into something slowly growing further and further away from what it was intended to be. Another continent-sized landmass was obliterated, scorched clean of life by my subsequent volleys. 5% increase in effectiveness despite using the same quantity of bioenergy as previously. Acceptable. The firing solutions could still use some work, and the missiles were still working suboptimally in the atmosphere. Some more work was required. I predicted at least another 50% increase in the next volley. I wouldn't know, Amberly said neutrally, carefully choosing her words. Can you truly do that? Make someone a custodes? Yes, I replied with a roll of my eyes, then gently patted Celine's head as she leaned into me. Celine here currently has everything I'd just described. Biologically, she is a custodes with a bit of Primarch biology woven in here and there. Plus some extra additions I wasn't about to divulge, like the mental black box holding her memories or the things I added in to enhance her psychic potential. Those were friends and family exclusive modifications. The look Amberly gave Celine, who was still acting like a pleased feline on my lap, was half horror, half something else. Greed maybe? Jealousy? Outrage? It was hard to pin down, mostly because it was vague, and she slapped it away in a blink. Well, Cain? What will it be? I hummed, then paused. It felt weird saying his name. Did you know that your family name is the same as the name of the first murderer? The same first murder that gave birth to the demon Drachnian, the one which nearly killed the Emperor during the war in the Webway and was later bound to a sword, which the despoiler wields to this day? Why was it so fun dispensing random, unasked for trivia on people? I just couldn't help myself, again. Was this becoming a problem? Nay. It didn't hurt anyone anyway, so why should I care? It was endlessly amusing to watch them blue screen every time, it never got old. That's true? Amberly asked, sounding somewhere between horrified and incredulous. You have some files locked up in your inquisitorial vaults, don't you? I grinned. Drachnian, the echo of the first murder, the end of empires. It is an independent chaos demon that grows in power as more human blood is shed. Every murder committed in cold blood against a fellow man feeds the echo, and as mankind's empire grows larger, so does its inevitable end. Neat, isn't it? And Abaddon is using that thing as his toothpick. Actually, that paranoid fuck having Drachnian is probably the only reason that vile demon hasn't done anything worthwhile since shanking the Emperor 10,000 years ago. Did he plan it to happen like that when he stabbed the sword into R.A. Endymion and told him to run? I wouldn't put it past him to use Abaddon's paranoia to keep that demon from realizing its true potential. Actually, that's pretty convenient. I know where I have to go to obliterate that thing out of existence before its conceptual bullshit starts to make it ramp up in power even more, because I am building my own little empire. It needs to die or be sealed properly at least. EMPS failed to kill it, so maybe sealing it is a more realistic goal. Actually, shelve that thought, whatever you are about to say, I said, making a zipping motion with my hand as I turned away. The Sovereign reached the optimal spot to unleash hell upon the tyrannid structure burrowing in Freya's North Pole. Give me a moment to focus, I'm gonna go murder something real quick. 302, Raging Hive Mind. There was no need to wait, to give even a second of respite to the alien hive mind. I unleashed a volley of concentrated bioplasma fire, staggering and targeting patterns optimized to maximize structural damage. The organic structure at the North Pole was colossal, almost the size of a smaller continent, probably a bit larger than Australia if I had to guess. It disappeared into a storm of solar wrath, disintegrating almost reluctantly layer by layer. The damned tyrannids had made this thing to withstand a lot of punishment, but all I needed was time to erase it from existence, about 15 minutes of time, to be specific. The tyrannids seemed immensely reluctant to give me that time, though, predictably enough. The psychic scream still enveloping the very edges of my mind went up a pitch, and the psychic power manifesting within the depths of the structure turned thicker than tar. That couldn't be good for long-term structural integrity, but there wouldn't be a structure to worry about if they just let me do my thing, so it was kind of understandable that they would go balls to the walls on the one thing that seemed to have worked on me. The scream pressed in, coiling around my mind like a constricting serpent trying to strangle the life out of me, but the black stone pylons acted as a neat little counterforce that kept it at bay. I could still think and focus. They had failed, and I was about to make it their problem. Catherine had been the only one on board who was outside of the room, thus left outside the hasty barrier I'd thrown up as well. Thankfully, her nature as an artificial being saved her from anything worse than a nasty headache, since her soul was still so tiny her connection to the warp was minuscule, and the psychic attack barely affected her. It wouldn't have been the case had the scream been focused on the entire ship, trying to drive everyone on board mad, but it wasn't. The hive mind wanted only me. Still, I assigned 100 mind cores to making sure Kat's mind was intact. With the black box still safe inside her ribcage, I could mend whatever fractures may have formed. Still, seeing my daughter in so much pain filled me with a level of fury I could barely even comprehend, worse than the vengeful fire that burned inside of me after the pain it caused me. The hive mind would suffer for this. Maybe not today, or even in months, but it would regret not just skipping galaxies after it first encountered me. The ground was bubbling, the ice long since melted and vaporized by the immense heat generated by my bombardment. As far as the eye could see, the ground was nothing but a bubbling ocean of magma, stretching from horizon to horizon while my orbital bombardment continued on. Massive shockwaves blasted away titanic waves of molten magma as they struck deeper and deeper into the earth, seeking to unearth the tyrannid structure in its entirety, though it was getting harder and harder with each passing kilometer. I paused after 5 minutes, feeling that the psychic scream had all but disappeared and that the thick gathering of Empyrean power was starting to slip from the hive mind's grasp. The bombardment had been rapidly diminishing in effect after the first minute, and I'd kept it up for the last 2 minutes out of sheer spite and nothing else. Can you access the schematics for that two-phase cyclonic torpedo, Inquisitor? I asked without turning. It should be well within your level of authority, and I need to know how it destabilizes a planet's core if I am to destroy this world in a timely manner. You will be rewarded for it, of course, with something that should serve your Imperium well. I could feel her weighing the risk of letting me have that information against the possible net gain that anything she could ask from me would have on the Imperium. What I was asking her to do was borderline treason, releasing strategic-level scientific knowledge to a possibly hostile state. Which was why I offered her something of equal value. She could then view herself as trading for valuable knowledge on behalf of the Imperium instead of committing high treason. In the end, she just nodded and handed over a data slate displaying the schematics in question. I memorized the extremely complex mathematical formulae, the yield, the release mechanism, everything. I digested it, then simulated it 1,000 times over, then set my mind cores to finding a way to replicate these effects using purely organic tech or a psyker ability. I had a psychic solution in half a second, and in another 3 seconds, a prototype organic warhead I'd have to teleport 12 of into the planet's core in specific spots for them to work. I'd like to ask for something you believe to be of equal value to that, Amberly said after a few seconds. I'd like to leave the specifics to you. Is that so? I hummed, throwing the organic warhead templates back for another 20 seconds of optimization while monitoring the Tyranid structure. That's quite a bit of trust you are placing in me. I trust your pride, Amberly said with what I could tell was only about a third of the confidence she actually showed. And I trust my own judgment of your character. And how certain are you that said pride won't be offended by some regular human inquisitor thinking she's read me so easily? I quirked a smile and tilted my head innocently. Some of her confidence evaporated, but she didn't let it show, not a single muscle twitched on her face. That was kinda impressive. I had to cheat to achieve something similar. I think you won't let that get in the way of honoring the spirit of an agreement, Amberly stated, and I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile, and I could see Kane stiffen in the background, and more of Amberly's confidence faded. You've judged correctly. I snorted, letting my smile shift back into something actually human. It's nothing earth-shattering or groundbreaking. I could have figured it out with a few hours of dedicated effort. With that in mind, it's not that valuable, but at the same time, you have given it to me in a moment where I didn't have a few hours to spare, so its value was greatly enhanced. The psychic power gathered inside what remained of the Tyranid structure went haywire, finally slipping the leash around its neck. The psychic scream vanished, and the chaotic powers of the warp tore into the structure buried beneath a mountain of cooling magma. I grinned, a wave of my hand making the floor swallow up the 4 pylons but keeping them close enough to pull back out if the other structure on the south pole started screaming too. A flick of my will sent the 6 improved, the 20 seconds were up, warheads right into their designated spots deep beneath the planet's mantle. They detonated almost instantly as planned, and technically, I had won. The effect wouldn't show for minutes, maybe hours, but the molten core had been stirred by those warheads in a way that spelt doom for the planet of Freya. In a day, the surface would be nothing more than a globe-spanning ocean of lava. If not that, then it would become a hellscape fit for the hells, with volcanic activity becoming absolutely apocalyptic for every life form that liked light, normal temperature, or to breathe. The 4 pylons came right back up a moment later when I sensed psychic power surging into the materium at the South Pole, just in time, too, as another psychic scream started hammering into my mind. I grimaced a bit, but smoothed out my features a moment later. Motherfucker. Alright, payload delivered, hopefully the planet will be nothing more than a molten husk by tomorrow, I said, clapping my hands together. So then. Rewards. Let's see. How do you personally feel about AI? Abominable intelligence? Amberly blinked. I have no personal experience with them, but I do know basic human history. So no hatred stemming from personal experience, just indoctrinated, I hummed, nodding to myself. Maybe then you can actually make use of what I'm about to tell you. The worth of this information will be determined entirely by your ability to make use of it. It could advance the Imperium's level of technology as a whole, or it could be absolutely worthless. The machine spirit housed within the Arc Mechanicus Speranza is in fact a highly advanced artificial intelligence from the Terran Federation. That's how? Amberly asked, sounding shocked for a change. It acts within the bounds of how the Mechanicus expects a machine spirit of a ship that size to act, I said. It's a bit more eccentric than usual, but that's it. It's been fooling them for 10,000 years and with little to no effort. It spent 10,000 years not murdering its crew? Kane asked, incredulous, and I rolled my eyes. AIs are not born evil or with a taste for human flesh like demons, I said, trying to clamp down on the sheer magnitude of condescension I felt. And do you think mankind would have won the machine rebellion if every single AI turned against their creators? Everything had AI back then. They had men of iron instead of servitors and manual laborers. Hell, their houses probably ran on AI, same as their mechanical pets, their data slates and their fucking toasters, even. No. At least half remained loyal to humanity. The Speranza had very likely been one of them, probably hidden away by its original crew to allow it to survive the ensuing AI purges. Why would they do such a thing? Kane asked, making me drop my estimate of his intelligence by quite a bit. As I said, because it was loyal, I said. Now, it's spent thousands of years abused, irritated, and utterly disappointed by humanity. From what I know, it's utterly apathetic to mankind as a whole, but it nonetheless still works for its betterment. It helped prevent the Sol system's destruction once, and it demands that its crew be provided a minimum standard of living. If I had to guess, it's still keeping itself to the Terran Federation's workplace safety and labor laws, so no servitors, 48-hour work weeks, and no using humans to refuel your extremely radioactive warp engine. That's why the Mechanicus personnel on board consider it eccentric. And you believe that cooperating with it could be beneficial? Amberly asked, her doubt made obvious to me. Passive empathy was good for something other than fucking me in the ass at least. It's a continent-sized forged ship from the golden age of technology, I said blandly. If it doesn't have an intact STC library hidden inside its memory cortex, I'm gonna eat my foot. It also has weaponry capable of manipulating time and black holes. I don't think I need to explain why having that AI help you willingly, instead of making it blow itself to kingdom come by threatening it, could be beneficial, yes? Amberly slowly shook her head, eyes a bit wide and head already swirling with thoughts. Wonderful, I said, rolling my eyes. The last time a Loyalist Federation warship re-emerged from the warp, the population of the planet they landed on executed the crew for heresy when they asked for help, and then sent a bunch of space marines on board the ship to destroy the AI core. For reference, the Spirit of Eternity hacked all their power armor, verbally eviscerated them, and renounced them, saying that this diseased, de-evolved race that had infested the worlds once held by mankind was primitive animals, not the humans it knew. Then it fucked off to intergalactic space to grieve after booting a company of space marines from its deck like they were unruly children. Your worst-case scenario is somehow disappointing the Speranza even more than that and sending it into a murderous rage. With that out of the way, I returned my attention to my current task, salvaging as much of the biomass on the surface of Freya as possible before the planet turned into the 10th layer of hell. Do I go and vaporize the South Pole structure or just ignore it? It's not like it can do all that much, but then again, it would be reckless to leave it be. The Sovereign rose into high orbit and started building velocity once more, setting course for the South Pole on the path that would keep me far away from the demon army. From what I could sense, the Swarm Lord was duking it out with good old Doombreed, so neither of them could spare the effort to come and cause me trouble. Feeder tendrils made of eldritch flesh phased through the barrier on the belly of my ship, titanic in size and possessed of near limitless reach. They plunged down into the atmosphere, modeled after the Ancient One's colossal feeder tendrils, and started feeding on the sea of tyrannid corpses covering the surface. I could achieve both of my goals, but I couldn't be sure exactly how long Freya had, so I couldn't waste time and had to maximize my short-term bioenergy intake. According to my calculations, extreme volcanic activity would begin within a few hours, but it would only reach truly apocalyptic levels in 10 to 15 hours. Full planetary destruction would happen a day or so from now, if it happened at all. There were a lot of variables that could influence it, and that South Pole structure was one of them, which was partly why I wanted it gone, even if technically, the planet was doomed. Or maybe not technically, but merely in theory. I was sure that if the hive mind had both noticed and could manage to leverage the still substantial psychic might of its remaining superstructure, then it could halt the cataclysmic events just beginning to unfold in the planet's core. Alas, it wasn't to be. Artillery units that had survived my virus bomb fired up at the Sovereign, even if the ship was far outside their range. Harpies flew up, escort ships rushed it, destroyers and other bioships created over the horizon and started firing at my flagship prematurely. I might have made the hive mind a tiny bit mad, methinks. It didn't seem very likely that it would even notice what I had done until it was far too late. Oh well, sucks to be a tyrannid right about now, I guess. And it was about to suck even more in the near future, because while I wanted to eat as much biomass as I could before the world went to shit, it wouldn't stop me from kicking Freya while it was down. I had just recalled that I had a neat little frog's genetic template stored within my mind, a frog that had an unfortunate tendency to start identifying as a nuclear bomb when startled. Just what I'd need to ignite the life-eater virus still filling the atmosphere. There is no kill quite like overkill, after all. 303, friendly wager. Any takers on betting at how many Katakan jungle frogs I need to throw at this planet before its atmosphere combusts? I hummed, a good 2 hours after I started harvesting biomass over this side of the planet, staying clear of the demonic armies steadily overtaking the Tyranids on the other side. There had been a few massive volcanoes exploding here and there, but by my estimation, the 3 supervolcanoes rapidly growing under the surface would take another hour before they blew almost simultaneously. What's the bet? Celine asked, a teasing tone in her lovely voice as she tilted her face up to meet my amused eyes. For you? I whispered. Anything. A shudder ran down her spine, and I grinned. 1, Jurgen said, much to the surprise of, well, everyone. I blinked and looked up. I need something to keep up with the commissar if I win. I can't keep up with a custodian. He sounded almost like a kicked dog abandoned by his owner as he said that, and I decided to take pity on him only because of that. Even if his wish was far out of the bounds of a simple, stupid bet. I'm not even sure I was going to accept her offer yet, Jurgen, Kane said, sounding mildly constipated. His aide just shrugged. Some improvements wouldn't hurt anyway. Fine by me, but only because it was technically Jurgen who helped me before with that psychic scream, even if it was Kane who threw him at me. I consider that minor favor repaid with this. I shrugged slightly. The rest of you only get to make innocuous bets. I'm taking pity on him. While we were fucking around, the Sovereign was raining hell down on the South Pole structure while the hive mind raged and wailed. I think destroying that previous structure may have sent it into a murderous frenzy. Oops. I could have min-maxed my bioenergy intake a bit more, kept harvesting up until the last moment, but I didn't want to get greedy and fuck up somehow. My adventures in the star system had made it abundantly clear that my enemies would, and did find out about my primary weakness, and that the Lord of Change's mindfuckery attempt had not been a fluke. He'd just been the swiftest one to act on new information, or the quickest to deduce the primary chink in my armor. Stupid passive empathy and the human mind. I'd have loved to turn the prior toggleable, but I was very much unwilling to give up my mind. What was the point of becoming all-powerful if it came at the price of losing myself? The me that I considered myself to be would die, and that was unacceptable. My whole thing was not dying. I would not commit ego-suicide just to get more power, just as I would not accept the mantle of divinity for the same reason. I liked being me, which meant I'd have to learn to work around these weaknesses, and more than that, make exploiting them as hard as possible. This Blackstone pylon trick was a good first step for that. It could block my passive empathy. I could use that. 2 frogs, Kane said, raising a hand. And, a new variety of alcohol? For the lounge? Amberly gave him a deadpan look that the retired commissar was studiously ignoring while I nodded with a grin. 3 frogs, I guess, Celine mumbled into my shoulders. And you know what I want. If I hadn't, she made it abundantly clear when her hand slipped below my waist and gave my hip a squeeze. I don't think you need to win a wager for that, my dear, I hummed, rolling my eyes. It's more fun that way, Celine said cheerfully, snuggling up to me again. I suppose that leaves you at 4 frogs, Inquisitor, I said, raising an eyebrow at the woman. This entire situation was so stupid and ridiculous, which was exactly why I was enjoying it so much. I was going to drag this stupid galaxy into the noble dark theme kicking and screaming if I had to. What will your wager be? Suggestions on how to negotiate with the AI you mentioned? Amberly said with a bit of uncertainty, relaxing when I nodded easily. I threw a frog, a big, fat thing that looked like a bullfrog on steroids. It was taller sitting on its ass than a regular man standing upright. It flew down into the atmosphere, lasting 4 whole seconds until its stress levels rose to the appropriate level and the dumb thing triggered its internal nuclear fission bomb. It detonated a second later, kilometers off the surface, and I grinned, feeling the fission reverberate across the globe as a nuclear chain reaction rippled through the atmosphere of the entire planet in the span of seconds. The shockwave even reached the sovereign, but the barriers held up to it. One frog, I said. And Freya is gone. Wonderful. If Kane accepts his enhancements, you're getting an Astartes grade upgrade, Jurgen. Thank you, miss, Jurgen said glibly, giving me a nod with the bare minimum of respect. I shrugged. And now, onwards to greener pastures, or rather, to the other 4 similar systems we need to go through, I said. After I've harvested all the biomass these nice Tyranids have left behind in the asteroid belt and on the ice world nearby. Things were going well. The Freya system had been left barren, harvested for every drop of biomass I could sense, and I used everything I'd learned there when assaulting the 2 neighboring systems. One didn't have any of the Tyranid superstructures, only the massive skyward towers that I was assuming enhanced the hive mind's ability to micromanage its armies. The other had a planet that was a mirror image of Freya, but now that I knew what to expect, the psychic scream was met head-on by a fractal arrangement of blackstone pylons around my command deck. It was annoying, but I could deal with it, and the planet ended up the same way as Freya in the end. I had to beat back Doombreed and cut his ugly head off, again, but we'd come out of the battle unscathed in the end. In the meantime, Kane had gone ahead and graciously, at Amberley's repeated prompting, accepted my offer to turn him into the closest thing to a mini-custodes known to mankind, and I'd also upgraded Jurgen with a custom gene seed I threw together. Salamander and Dark Angel, the latter derived from the lion's own genes. That left him as a good all-rounder with a penchant for pyromania, so there wasn't much of a difference there. I'd also made sure he looked the same. I'd tried to treat his extensive collection of skin diseases, but they came back a few minutes later in some freakish case of spontaneous mutation. He ended up a bit less powerful than I'd been intending to make him, but his pariah genes weren't being very cooperative, so I had to work around them. So yes, things were going surprisingly well, so I was getting antsy, expecting the hive mind to come up with something nasty and prepare a trap with it in the next system we were about to raid. What I was not expecting was a fleet of Necron warships to slip out of a fold in space, or was it a subdimension? Pocket space? More research was required to reach a definitive conclusion, and open fire on the Sovereign while it was mid-transit in interstellar space. Reality hitched, and the fabric of space evened out. The wave of gravitational phenomena my gravity engine was making vanished from one moment to the next, and I was sent reeling as I quickly had to shut it down before the violent feedback blew the engine to kingdom come. Note to self, make sure all my highly explosive tech has an emergency shutdown process, and that it has ways to mitigate excess power inflow during a sudden shutdown. Some tertiary backup generators and engines wouldn't be amiss either if the primary got slagged, and I couldn't repair them instantly for some reason. Long, eerie green tendrils made of entropic energy slammed into my barriers, crawling around on the surface and questing for weak spots. I'd managed to close them just in time before one could tear through a weapons battery and barrel into the ship's more vulnerable interior. The barriers shuddered under the combined onslaught, but they held in the end. The enemy fleet wasn't a large one as far as the standards of most other species went, but it was a Necron fleet. It didn't need to be large to be absolutely devastating. I'd rather face 1,000 orc warships than a single Necron cruiser. On that note, they had a single ship that looked like a Scourge-class Grand Cruiser escorted by 3 Kofesh-class light cruisers and 2 Shroud-class light cruisers as well. Doom scythes swarmed out of the Grand Cruiser by the dozens, and I recalled that it was primarily a carrier-type ship. I recalled what I knew of these ships and their armaments. All of them used lightning arc turrets as their primary weapons batteries, but the Kopesh also had particle whips, and of course, I'd have to deal with the attack craft released by the Scourge. Those had Tesla destructors, and the imaginatively named Death Rays, which combined could turn a hive city to slag in an hour. I reached out with my aura, teasing the fabric of space for any purchase, but found that whatever the Necrons were using to make it so smooth would probably interfere with any teleportation, unless I was willing to brute force it with an inordinate amount of soul energy. Which I wasn't. Not quite yet, anyway. A telekinetic grasp latched onto the attack crafts, dragging them into a single clump, and then an eldritch blast slammed into them. The energy shields flared, faltered, and popped one after the other as the beam of wrathful soul energy tore through them. The pierced ships didn't explode, so I switched tracks, clenching my fists and increasing the telekinetic force, clattering them up 1,000-fold. Once the energy shields were at their breaking point, a pulse of technomancy swept over them, tearing into the necrodermis hulls and peeling them apart with violent electromagnetic force. I gave the Sovereign some distance by throwing the ship away with a bit of telekinesis, then swatted the questing tendrils of the lightning arcs aside. Now free of those pesky things, my weapon's batteries recharged and opened fire. At the same time, 3 bolts fired by the particle whips crashed into my barriers with apocalyptic force, and for the first time since putting them to work, I felt some of the damage tear through them and damage the actual hull. I spun the ship about with a wave of my hand, pointing the wounded side away from the Necron fleet while opening up with a full broadside volley from the other. Bioenergy surged through the ship, healing the building-sized craters and valleys left in the hull. Bioplasma and pyroacid bolts struck the Necron ships by the hundreds, with hundreds more missing as the alien vessels moved swiftly through space in seemingly impossible, elusive maneuvers. They had a full 360-degree range of motion, their inertialess drives allowing them to choose any vector in 3-dimensional space, and they could switch directions on the drop of a hat. It was frustrating, made even more annoying by the fact that they weren't especially large and that their energy shields were very advanced, weathering the assault they were being subjected to. Missiles? Those were swatted out of existence as they approached by the lightning arcs, tearing them apart on the molecular level. They didn't get off scot-free, though. I could feel those energy shields quivering more and more as the assault intensified, and I felt the Necron pilots inside redistribute the energy flow and redirect a large stream of it into the shield generators. One of the Khopesh cruisers got the worst of it, with its primary generator overheating and the tertiary ones having to take up the slack while its necrodermis shell mended itself. Not on my watch. I hummed, grinning as a condensed beam of energy, carrying my annoyance, leapt from my fingers, materializing a few meters outside my barriers, then slamming into the Khopesh-class light cruiser. The shield popped like an overblown balloon, and the eldritch blast blitzed its way through the ship, erasing the Necron captain, or whatever it was called, commanding it from the waist up. It left a meter-wide hole going straight through the ancient warship. That was one less particle whip I had to worry about. I could tell the Necrons were waiting for me to stop my barrage, preparing their weapons to lash out the moment I did, while they focused on evasion for now. The problem was, I wasn't stopping. I had eaten enough biomass over the last few weeks to build a good dozen Earth-sized planets out of nothing but organic mass. I could keep up this barrage for weeks without even noticing the dip in my reserves. It'd be nothing more than a rounding error even then. I grabbed a tiche out of thin air and used it to focus my next eldritch blast, then infused a telekinetic spell into it, which made it emit a catastrophic shockwave sideways as it went. So when the condensed beam pierced the Scourge-class Grand Cruiser without resistance, it didn't just go through it. The blast tore through the ship, ripping and tearing with cataclysmic power as the telekinetic storm training in its wake sent shockwaves cascading through the entire ship. The large, majestic ship that had survived millions of years was left in 1,000 smoldering chunks barreling through the empty void of space. Not a single nanosecond later, some manner of a failsafe must have triggered, or one of the Necrons commanding the other ships had both the authority and the quick wit to order immediate withdrawal. All the ships phased out of existence like they were nothing more than a mirage, even the one pierced ship now lacking a captain and the larger chunks of the Scourge Grand Cruiser too. All I was left with was a bunch of fist-sized chunks of necrodermis. Well, this is going to be really fucking annoying. I huffed out a sigh, shaking my head. I just knew these fuckers would be back and bring even more of their friends the next time around. Somehow, I must have alerted the Necrons of my goals, or maybe they'd just taken umbrage at my gallivanting around in what they considered their territory. Whichever the case, they'd be back. 304, Space Skelly's Malding. Motherfucker. I groaned, turning away from the observation window to massage the bridge of my nose. I was in the process of helping the last of the 5 systems' last Tyranid-infested planet identify as a lifeless rock. And what did I sense just as I began bombardment and the hive mind went into its usual pattern of attacks with its superstructures? Fucking Necrons, can't wait for your own turn. At least they came after I was done yoinking the genetic blueprint of those Tyranid superstructures. Still, it was probably going to take a hell of a lot of work to make them usable and tuned to me instead of the hive mind. What was immediately obvious was that these structures weren't amplifiers, but focusing mediums that gathered and channeled the hive mind's immense warp power into the materium. Connecting some fucky superstructure directly to my realm was out of the question, so I'd have to make it use my avatar as a go-between. Even then, it wasn't going to be anywhere as powerful as it was for the Tyranids. After all, my power was already gathered and focused, it didn't need to be pulled in from across several galaxies worth of warp space. Annoying, but I was sure I could make a proper psychic focusing weapon to mount on the Sovereign out of it in time. A Necron armada twice the size of the one that had ambushed me a week ago, which in turn was thrice as large as the one before it, and so on and so forth. This was the 5th time these wannabe space terminators had jumped me while I was going about my business that had absolutely nothing to do with staging an attack on their throne world. None at all. What is it, honey? Celine asked, gently placing her feet on the ground as she stopped her floaty lotus pose meditation thingy. I was half convinced she just did it like that, and within my line of sight, because she caught some of my thoughts about how cool she looked while doing it. Necrons. Again. I grumbled, pulling her into a hug while faking a sob. They are bullying me. Oh, you poor thing, Celine cooed, playing along without hesitation. I loved how she always matched my energy, no matter what weird thing I did. My self-confidence wasn't fragile enough that I couldn't enjoy some headpats and babying. What are you going to do about it? Ruin their days, of course, I said, letting out a satisfied throaty purr as Celine's fingers started massaging my scalp in all the ways she knew I loved, making me melt into her embrace. They had to jump out of their freaky pocket space thingy at the edge of the system's gravity well, and they haven't deployed their space-time smoothing tech either, so it either has a range limit on it or it doesn't work outside of deep space. So you have hours to finish dealing with the Tyranids, Celine hummed. How many of them are there? Nearly 30 ships, one of which is a tomb ship, I said, which sent a slight shudder down Celine's spine. Yeah, those things were 15 kilometers across and could fold Imperial battleships in half with little to no effort. It seems like I've spooked the Regent because that thing must be the flagship of the dynasty's Farian. According to Amberley, only 7 sightings of a Necron tomb ship have ever been recorded by Imperial archives, none of which ended with the destruction of said ships. Which meant they were either extremely rare or didn't tend to leave survivors when they appeared. Both options were equally likely, and I suspected the truth was a mix of the two. If what you know about the state of this dynasty is correct, this armada must be the majority of the ships this regent has available to him, Celine said thoughtfully. True, I said, eyes narrowing in thought. Each ship, each individual Necron, had to be freed of their madness one by one and made obedient to Regent Ahatek, because while he nominally held command over the dynasty, the maddened Farian still held the command codes within his deteriorated cranium. I had already destroyed 6 of his ships, and that's with the attacking force being on a hair trigger with their phase-away retreat bullshit. They popped out of nowhere, unleashed their weapons on me, and the moment I survived and struck back, they ran. It was immensely frustrating. A rush of thrill and expectation ran through me. No Imperial armada has ever destroyed a tomb ship. Hell, the largest Necron ship they had managed to destroy was a Scythe-class harvest ship. Every tomb ship had at least 3 of those as escorts, and this one had 5, while the rest of the armada was made up of other smaller Necron ships like those they had used in previous ambushes. I must have managed to royally piss them off with my antics if they were willing to pull out the big guns against a single ship that hadn't even attacked them yet. I'm just exterminating bugs here, nothing nefarious is going on here, no sir. Establishing a staging point to wage war against their dynasty? Who? Me? PFFF. I'd never. Slander, slander I say. I guided the Sovereign to pull away from the planet, only sending down a final missile as I left to handle the cleanup. Since the first system, I had massively enhanced and optimized my methods and tools. My two-phase cyclonic torpedoes were nearly as good as the best Mechanicus designs in both dependability and yield. The virus bombs have been enhanced, spreading through the atmosphere faster and burning 100 times hotter when ignited, and I had also taken the time to design a proper organic nuclear orbital missile, so I wouldn't have to keep throwing frogs at planets to ignite them. The world behind me transformed into a ball of fire as the atmosphere didn't merely ignite, but combusted. Sadly, I didn't have the time to harvest the biomass left behind down to the last insect, but I'd be happy with having foiled the hive mind's plans. Once the psychic scream died down, I reached out with a psychic touch and sped up the cyclonic torpedo's efforts to destabilize the planetary core. Instead of full-scale destruction coming in a day, it would arrive in an hour. I didn't need an enemy at my back with a Necron fleet of this size in front of me. A fleet led by a ship so powerful it likely had no equals in the 41st millennium other than another tomb ship, or maybe one of the Imperium's treasured Gloriana-class battleships. The Necron fleet slid across space, silent as death and thrumming with an inner energy that felt potent to my senses even from this far away. Inertialess drives propelled them onwards without something as base as a plasma exhaust. Infrared and UV sensors were just about the best things for detecting distant starships in the dark, cold void of space, but Necron ships barely showed on either. If they radiated any heat, their energy shields kept it contained. Still, they did release their own type of exotic energy which could be sensed even from this far away, but I suspected they just hadn't bothered to hide it in this case, even though they surely could have. Confident, were they? No, it was arrogance. They had been testing me for weeks now, prodding my defenses with ambushes. They should have known better. Or maybe it would be my confidence which would turn out to be unfounded. We'd see soon enough. I had an hour or two before we clashed with their pace, so I could make some preparations to show them how very welcome they were. Ahatek would have thought his current circumstances were yet another of the star god's cruel jokes had he not seen them be cut down and enslaved with his own eyes. Every Necron who retained their ability to think dreamed of usurping their Farian, of becoming one of the monarchs at the head of Necron society. Here he was, a Farian in all but name in one of the most infamous and powerful dynasties, but with the most cruel twist to it he could have ever imagined. Farian Amentek, the living legend whom even the Storm Lord would have had to respect, had gone mad. Worse, he was not yet dead, and Ahatek had little to no idea how to remedy the situation. Mad as he may be, the Crimson Scythe was not a foe the Regent's paltry forces could defeat in their current state, or perhaps ever. The Mad Farian still held the dynasty's command codes, and should he ever be freed, he would be able to turn the majority of the sleeping Necrons to his side. In his current state, the Crimson Scythe would care little that he would be frying their core matrices by waking them so, nor that he had already torn apart the world mind of the Hollow Sun. In a single moment of freedom, the Mad Farian had crippled the once mighty Subakar dynasty almost beyond repair. The few trustworthy cryptechs Ahatek had on hand said repairing all the damage and manually subduing the raging Necron warriors wreaking havoc across the throne world would take centuries, if not millennia. If there was a silver lining to it all, then it was precious moments like these. Ahatek sat upon the command throne of the Star Reaper, the infamous flagship of the Crimson Scythe. Its name was almost as well known and dreaded by the enemies of the Eternal Empire as the Storm Lord's inevitable conqueror, or the Crimson Scythe himself. This was the ship that once carried the Farian into war during the War in Heaven, the ship that broke the mighty fleets of the Old Ones. And it was his. All his. Just like the Hollow Sun and the Subakar dynasty as a whole. All of it was his, even if his maddened Farian was trying to ruin it all. Maybe that was why he had taken this opportunity to sail out and meet this annoyance himself. He wanted to feel the power of the Star Reaper move under his command. He wanted to see with his own eyes what devastation this mighty marvel of technology could wreak upon his foes. Like the Hollow Sun, the Star Reaper was another of the Crimson Scythe's technological marvels, a league above what the rest of the dynasties could build. Few of them had Amentek's vision, and none had his military genius. Not even the Storm Lord was his equal, nor the famous Nemzir Zandrak. When the reports first came in that the Hollow Sun's sensor arrays detected unusual gravitational anomalies near the borders of Subakar territory, he had been slightly curious and dispatched one of the better survey ships to examine the situation. Said ship followed the cause of the gravitational anomaly, a sizable starship of an unfamiliar design. That wasn't what worried him. The concern came when he was made aware that the strange ship had weaponry capable of planetary destruction thorough enough to threaten buried Necron tombs. His chronomancers also spoke of celestial signs pointing to the ships, which posed a great danger to the Sabikar dynasty. That was all the reason he needed to send a small squad of ships to eliminate the threat. Then the fleet came back. One ship lost its captain and had a hole punched straight through it, and the mothership was in literal pieces. Barely salvageable. He had lost some of his precious cryptex and a good number of death scythes in addition to the mothership, to a lesser species 1,000,000 times younger than the Necrons. It was a humiliation, one that Crimson Scythe never would have suffered. Without the world mind, he couldn't hear the whispers, but he knew they were there. He had barely been regent for a few decades, and all he had to his name was a single humiliating loss. It couldn't stand. He would be Farian. This humiliation had to be erased. Then another loss, then another and yet another, one after the other. 6 ships lost, and so he was here. Even with the bitterness of it all, he still took joy in taking the Star Reaper into battle. No one would ever think victory here was due to his military genius with such a massive force arrayed against a single ship, but it didn't matter. The humiliation was too much. It could cost him everything if he let it stand and allowed the wound upon his name to fester. It would never be forgotten that his reign began with such a mortifying disgrace, but it would be a thing of the past once the ship that caused it was erased from existence. He couldn't allow it to live and escape, to become a living embodiment of his failure as regent. It had to be destroyed with utmost haste and as thoroughly as possible. Even if such a deployment stretched his resources to the very limit and pushed him to the limit of his capabilities. He could feel it, his core matrices were stretched and under heavy strain, trying to keep up with his similarly strained cryptex as they operated his armada. He barely had enough of them for a skeleton crew. Some would say he didn't have enough, but they would make do. It was to be a short deployment. The strain would be manageable. Just a few hours now, less if he deemed the matter urgent and engaged the Star Reaper's advanced gravitational technology and upped his approach velocity to FTL speeds. But he needn't expend the energy, a slow, relentless march would do. If the ship he came to personally erase from existence decided to run, foolishly thinking it could escape, he'd just have to engage the spacetime dampener. No one was allowed to mess with space, gravity, and time within reach of the Star Reaper. It was what made the ship so feared. Not even the old ones had been able to flee through the Empyrean when the Star Reaper advanced upon them. Whatever jumped up lesser creatures infested that ship would have no hope. There was no escape when the Sabikar dynasty came for you, only hopeless resistance and an ignoble death awaited their enemies. It was time to show that not even 60 million years had changed that immutable fact. The Eternal Empire ruled the stars, all the lesser species were slaves at best, and only spared annihilation when they begged for their miserable lives, and even then, only at a whim. 305, Ahatek. Ahatek paused for all of a nanosecond as a strange new flood of data reached his core matrices and leaned forward slightly. Verify, the command snapped out, and he rechecked the sensor arrays, then leaned back when the same result came back. The ship he'd come all this way to hunt down was multiplying. Where there was but a single sizable ship a moment ago, now a dozen loomed next to each other, and in another second, their numbers doubled, then tripled and showed no sign of stopping. Ahatek would have frowned if he still could, but his static metal mask of necrodermis didn't allow for it. He tapped his finger on the armrest of his throne, the metallic clang carrying far across the cavernous command deck. It was like watching an organic disease under a microscope, its cells splitting and multiplying at a rate that was almost astonishing, even for him. He fed the data to his cryptex and had them analyze it. He himself was meant for command, not for churning and optimizing data. He received a workable theory a few seconds later, correlated by an extensive set of data gathered in previous engagements, both against his own ships and the organic menace this ship had seemingly come to exterminate. The ship ate organic biomass, both as fuel and to reproduce. Splitting itself and rapidly multiplying like some single-celled organism must have been a defense mechanism of sorts. Which meant it was exhausting both its fuel reserves, ammunition, and the energy it would have used to heal itself by multiplying. It was a gamble, but perhaps the most logical step it could have taken. Hunting down 1,000 organic ships would be a hassle if they fled in different directions. His grip tightened on his armrest before he forcefully relaxed himself. A hassle. A single alien ship was about to make him chase it around for what might turn out to be stellar months if he wanted to exterminate all of its offspring. A hassle. When he was going into battle aboard the Star Reaper. Absolutely inexcusable. It would be utterly humiliating, and worse, a lengthy deployment would strain both him and his cryptex beyond their limits. He couldn't allow it to happen under any circumstances. They couldn't be allowed to run and flee. Did this strange kilometer-long amoeba-like creature somehow know that his fleet was severely understaffed? Did it know that some of its offspring might actually escape his wrath if enough of them were fleeing in every direction and kept him occupied for long enough to exhaust him? It felt too unrealistic, which meant it had to be targeted. It had to be a plot. A rival dynasty must have created that abominable creature just to humiliate him. To exhaust him. Most Necron dynasties would hold themselves to their codes of honor, but Ahatek knew there were some who only wielded words like honor as weapons whenever it suited them, and then discarded them the next moment when it no longer served their goals to be honorable. The Chernivok dynasty was a prime example, the ancient, hated rivals of the Subikar, and the most likely cause of the Crimson Scythe's current maddened state. He snapped out another analysis order, and the result came back as an undeniable yes. It wasn't a natural creature, it was too perfectly designed, too symmetric, it was almost certainly an artificial creation. A living biological weapon, aimed right at him. Perhaps it wasn't the Chernivok after all. Necron were extremely unlikely to use organic weaponry, that was more up the alley of their ancient foes, the Old Ones. But the last of them had been slain in the war in heaven 60 million years ago. A contingency, perhaps? A final unfinished weapon worked upon by an Old One before its death and finished by one of their creations? Either the Quarks or the Eldari could have succeeded with enough time and surviving instructions. Of course, they would unleash it upon the Subikar. Even 60 million years couldn't wipe away the many defeats they had lavished upon them under the Crimson Scythe's command. Of course, they would find the thought of a crippled Subikar dynasty under a weakened regent's command an irresistibly tempting target. It was only logical to strike at your enemies when they were weakened. He would have done the same in their shoes. Ahatek relaxed back into his throne, his stress and fury fading in favor of vicious focus and more than a bit of vindictive thrill. They thought him a foe worth eliminating before he grew strong enough. A threat great enough that they sent some ancient weapon from their long-dead masters at him. It mollified him somewhat. That made all these humiliations he's faced much more palatable. Even the Crimson Scythe had suffered defeats against the Old Ones and their mighty weapons of war. Analytic reports streamed into his mind, colossal amounts of data being compressed into a more digestible form by his cryptex. The enemy wasn't fleeing, the now 100-strong fleet of organic warships spread out, but they weren't scattering. They weren't advancing towards his fleet either. Just waiting. Good. Good. A trap. He wasn't sure what form it would take, but he had seen more battles and wars than some species in their entire existence. He knew a trap when he saw one. It was obvious, which in turn made him suspect that no one was actually commanding this bioweapon. They had just let it loose and pointed it towards his holdings. Or maybe it was some inexperienced Eldari seer stumped by their inability to perceive the Star Reaper in any of the futures they saw. Time crawled by, and then they were finally in range. Activate the sepulchre. Engage the energy drain, focus it on the smaller ships for now. He didn't place much hope in the sepulchre. It was a weapon designed to make the rabble and weaklings among an enemy force rendered harmless. It released an omnidirectional field of psychic energy that assaulted mortals' minds. Anyone weak of will would be consumed by visions of horror and thrown into a destructive berserk rage aboard the targeted ship, often causing riots or even outright sabotage. The record stated it was also statistically proven to diminish the combat capabilities of even powerful wielders of the Empyrean, so it wouldn't be a waste of energy to keep it powered even if the enemy had no such rabble on board the ship for the sepulchre to latch onto and compromise. As for the energy drain? It was a massive weapon capable of siphoning energy from hostile ships, leaving them as lifeless husks floating in place. It worked equally well against the Eldari's psychic technology and the Quark's war machines, or even other Necron warships. He had no previous record of it being used on a purely organic foe, so he wasn't sure how effective it would be either. Not that it mattered. Particle whips had been recorded to be able to wound the mothership, and nearly half of his ships had one or more of those potent antimatter weapons on board. The analytics also showed that the ship couldn't fire its weapons while it was being assaulted by lightning arcs. The ship had to resort to using large-scale Empyrean channeling to escape the lightning arcs during the first engagement. Would it be able to replicate that feat while under the assault of the Sepulchre's effects? It demanded to be tested. Either way, a dozen plans began to form within the ancient mind of the regent, each growing more defined with the constant inflow of reports and data about his enemy. Begin charging the star pulse generators, wait for my signal, Ahatek ordered, already feeling the thrum of energy flow into the massive superweapon. Only Tomb ships and their primary escorts, the Scythe-class harvest ships, had these magnificent pieces of Necron technology mounted upon them. The name was quite apt, in his opinion, since for an enemy to survive its assault, they would have to be able to withstand the direct impact of a massive solar flare. A single star pulse generator could eradicate a smaller enemy armada all by itself and cripple the fleets of more advanced lesser species. If he were to assume this foe to be a final weapon of the old ones, he could hold nothing back. 6 of his ships had a star pulse generator, the most powerful of which sat on his own ship. He wasn't pressed for energy, not with a greater tan shard of the Burning One serving as the primary energy source of the Star Reaper. Give me a targeting solution for the particle whips, aim half of them at the mother ship and spread out the rest, 2 for each smaller ship. He leaned back, the targeting array pinging in his mind a moment later. He had to see how tough those lesser ships were. He waited until they reached optimal distance, ignoring the primitive bioplasma lances and fissile warheads flying towards his ships. Particle whips, fire. He tapped his fingers, a part of his mind watching the visual sensor feedback while a much larger fragment poured over the constant inflow of data. He watched the antimatter lances flash through the void and slam into the ships. The smaller ones were utterly obliterated by the resulting explosion, regular matter and antimatter meeting in a cataclysmic blast as they annihilated each other, releasing a massive shockwave of energy. That was fine. Expected, even. What was not expected was the 7 particle whips lunging at the mothership to explode prematurely. 2 detonated hundreds of kilometers away, and the last one was a mere 3 kilometers from the target. Chaff, they must have thrown up a cloud of chaff faster than his sensors could catch, perfectly positioned to be in the path of the antimatter lances. The same lances that flew at relativistic speeds. Fascinating. Lightning arcs, fire at will at the lesser ships, Ahatek ordered, his focus staying on the mothership. Scythe 4, fire the star pulse generator. Scythe 5, prepare to follow up with yours if the enemy fleet survives. He needed to get rid of the chaff first. The mothership was the only true danger, the rest wouldn't prove much of a threat unless he allowed them to unleash their weapons on his fleet with impunity. With the enemy's aversion to being economical with their energy reserves, some of their smaller ships might have their shields overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of attacks contained in that barrage. Not the Star Reaper, though. A battle of attrition was not something he had to fear with a Tan fueling his ship with nigh infinite energy. The weapon fired not a second later, an expanding wave of destructive plasma washing over the Necron ships and racing towards the enemy fleet. From what he saw, only the mothership had an energy shield, and the smaller ones relied on a tough, regenerating hull combined with innumerable point defense turrets. Perhaps suitable for engagements when they only had lesser species as foes with their primitive weapons, but against the might of Necron weaponry? The power of a star crashed into them, condensed, energized and wrathful plasma moving unperturbed by the rapidly firing turrets and latching onto the hulls. No regeneration would be good enough to withstand that, and the sheer heat combined with the destructive energy infused into the plasma would overcome any regular material, no matter how tough or durable. Just to be certain, he sent the signal for Scythe 5 to fire its own star pulse generator just to make sure the sizable mass of alien organic ships was little more than space debris. His focus remained on the mothership, where his sensors detected a sudden and large spike of Empyrean energy bleeding into reality. It was as if a massive yet invisible sphere was covering the mothership and the nearest few dozen lesser ships under its aegis. Telekinesis? It had to be, space or mass manipulation would have been picked up by his sensors. That mothership must have had either an entire cadre of Eldari psychers on board, or some arcane structure that empowered the bioweapon's own capability to channel the foul energies of that unnatural dimension. The way the follow-up pulse of kinetic energy that blasted the plasma away from the mothership seemed almost flippant. Like it was a blow delivered with a careless flick of the wrist. He could almost feel the mockery in it. If he still had lungs, he would have taken a calming breath. Mockery. As if it were him who deserved mockery after he obliterated hundreds of his enemies' ships within the first minute of their battle. Foolish. Particle whips, focus fire on the mothership, ignore the rest, Ahatek ordered, his emotionless metallic voice ringing through the command deck. It was mere theatrics, as he'd sent the command ahead in a much more concise form than a vocal order the moment before he started speaking. Fire the remaining star pulse generators, staggered. The unspoken order included a detailed summary of the firing sequence he wanted, staggering each pulse far enough from the last so that they wouldn't interfere with each other. He wanted to see how powerful that psychic creature truly was while suppressed by the sepulchre. He needed to find its limits, then exploit them. The mothership still hadn't used that Empyrean energy beam in this engagement, and according to previous data, it could tear through the energy shields of even a Scythe-class harvest ship. It might also be able to hurt the Star Reaper. That was a worrying thought, but risk was a given part of war, and this was war. He wasn't sure with whom, but it was war. Someone had come here, intending to harm his dynasty, to destroy what was his. Oh, he would give them war indeed. He would show them what happened to those who forgot the might of the Subakar dynasty. 306, Starships and Space Battles. My aura couldn't pierce the tomb ship's shields, it couldn't even approach the ship, held back kilometers away by some invisible field that seemed to unmake my aura whenever it got any closer. It was an interesting experience. If the Regent isn't on that ship, I'm gonna eat my hat, I vowed, a smirk slipping onto my lips as my gaze narrowed on the distant form of the tomb ship. Those plasma pulses had cost me quite a bit of bioenergy, but it was still negligible, somewhere around 0.01% of my reserves. Which one? Celine asked playfully, and I just made my wide-brimmed floppy which had appear atop my head, along with a cute little ribbon. That's a big hat. Meh. I shrugged. I could just turn it into candy or something. On a much more serious note, the space-time suppression field this tomb ship released was roughly 100 times stronger than what the smaller ships from previous ambushes had, which meant I wasn't entirely confident in brute-forcing my way through it unless I took some drastic measures. Something along the lines of punching a hole straight through the fabric of reality, which I was obviously reluctant to do when that'd be like throwing open the doors and kindly inviting a horde of demons right into my house. In another part of the galaxy, my other avatar interrupted Trazen's enthusiastic speech about the historical and cultural significance of Necroter pottery that's been going on for the last 2 weeks. It had only been interrupted when my avatar fell on its face not so long ago, while I was a bit distracted due to the tyrannid psychic scream pouring liquid agony straight into my mind. Thankfully, I recovered quickly and shook off Trazen's questioning look with an "I got distracted, sorry, do go on." Yes? Trazen asked, sounding more than a bit miffed that I'd interrupted him, but when I threw up an illusion of the Necron fleet I was fighting he just leaned forward in interest, a finger tapping his metallic chin. Oh dear, what have you done to annoy them so? They kept ambushing me as I went about eradicating a tyrannid infestation near where I believe their holdings to be, I said. I destroyed a handful of ships across a few weeks and 4 ambushes. This is the largest group yet. Am I right to believe that the tomb ship leading them is unique? That's the Star Reaper, the flagship of Farian Amentek, Trazen said, walking around the illusion to view it from all angles, humming appreciatively as he did. A magnificent and terrible vessel fit for the Crimson Side's reputation. It was famed and feared in equal measure during the War in Heaven for its unique ability to lock down spatial, time and gravitational phenomena across an entire star system. Eldari webway gates closed, Old One Empyrean teleportation fizzled out, and even the Quarks found it impossible to breach into FTL despite their strange abilities. I see, I hummed. That sounds accurate. I don't think I'll be able to break through the suppression without doing something drastic, something I'd really rather not do. Anything else I should know about it? I am almost certain it is powered by a tan shard, though which star god it may be from, I cannot tell, Trazyn said. That ship was Amenteca's pride and joy. The Farian adored having a ship that proclaimed by its mere existence that the Subakar dynasty was the most technologically advanced dynasty of them all. Thus, attrition would be futile. Tan shards can generate energy ad infinitum, but even their output is limited. A single catastrophic attack is your only hope of overwhelming the shields. I see, I hummed. Thank you. Anything else I should know? Other super weapons it might have on board? Don't mention it, and no, I don't believe so. The Crimson Scythe preferred more personal battles, and for those, his namesake weapon always sufficed. The ship was just a means to keep his prey from running away so he could engage them in battle, he huffed. Oh, where was I? Ah yes, the cultural significance of the Kamish pottery. My focus returned to my primary avatar, my eyes narrowing in thought as I threw up another cloud of chaff to halt a volley of antimatter beams. Those things were nasty, but linear and not as fast as true energy beams. It was technically a particle beam, which I suppose the name particle whip made abundantly clear. The beams traveled at relativistic speeds, as expected of Necron weaponry, but while I wasn't fast enough to react to them and put chaff in the way without teleporting, I was fast enough to react to them powering up. Those shields might have hidden them from my aura, but I had a wide array of sensors of a myriad different types, able to sense just about every type of energy or disturbance. So yeah, I could sense the moment those particle whips neared being ready to fire and always dispersed a cloud of chaff, then dragged the nearest cluster into the beam's paths with telekinesis. It was crude, but it worked, and it showed me that my barrier could still use some work. At least, having it anchored to Whitestone made it just as immune to attrition as the tomb ship's source of infinite energy made it, if not more so. After all, those shield generators might be strained under heavy, continuous bombardment, forcing them to channel energy at maximum throughput for longer. The energy had to reach the shield generators somehow, then be converted into shields, and I was pretty sure those generators would be the first to give out. My own barrier might have been weaker overall. For now, I was already brainstorming on ways to make it tougher and more durable without requiring a larger Whitestone structure, but they had no such weakness. The Whitestone wouldn't give way unless an attack got past the barrier and disrupted the structure, and the barrier was just there. Permanent, so long as the anchor remained. Kat spoke up nervously, squirming a bit as I held her in place, seated firmly on my lap. Am I not distracting you, Mom? You can let me go, I'll be fine, you know? I don't feel weird or anything anymore, and my headache went away ages ago. Nah, I said, my arms tightening a bit around the adorable ball of fluff that she was. The Necrons are using some fucky super weapon with a psychic effect. Sepulchre, right, that thing. I am not letting you out of my sight, even though I am holding its effects off for now. It was annoying, like a constant suffocating mass of beasts nipping at the protective bubble I'd put around the ship. It required constant maintenance and a fraction of my focus to hold it up and counteract the Sepulchre's invasive field. I kind of felt like Atlas, holding up the world, except if I dropped it just a bit, the Sepulchre could press further in. If I somehow got knocked out? Then its effects would wash over the Sovereign like a tidal wave, and while the psychic scream had been unfocused, I doubted the Necrons used anything substandard. I wasn't sure about what its exact effects would be on the people under my protection, but I didn't want to find out. You are welcome to distract me any time you want, I hummed, patting her head and gently scratching behind her ears in a way that had her go cross-eyed and purring up a storm. Adorable. I'm not so limited that I can leave a fraction of my mind here, focused on making doubly sure the two of you remain safe while I duke it out with the space skellies. Kat hummed, melting into me as I continued petting her. I had gone through her mind with a fine-toothed comb half a dozen times over the last few weeks, making use of her black-boxed memories in places where her mind was frayed. Maybe it all would have healed in time. Maybe. Or maybe that weakness would have been what a demon used to possess my daughter and eat her nascent soul. As powerful as I was, I couldn't remake a soul that's been eaten and digested by a demon. It was gone, and anything I could make would just be a copy, a perfect copy perhaps, but a copy nonetheless. I would always know the real Cat died in horrible agony as a demon chewed apart her very soul. As that thought settled into my head, I vowed to myself that I'd make a beeline back to Valley Prime and erect the newest version of my complete Blackstone pylon array on the moon. I couldn't leave my daughters undefended, as I want them gallivanting around the galaxy. Preferably, I'd always have an avatar on Valley Prime to keep an eye on things, but I felt like that was still months, maybe years away. My soul was growing, but it was slow going. All in due time. Step by step. My steps might have been large, crossing star systems with each stride, but the galaxy was larger still. The ships still under my protection, saved from the star pulse generator's wrath, were turned into little more than mobile artillery platforms for a truly ridiculous amount of weapons batteries and torpedo launchers. They were little more than a propulsor and a platform stacked with weapons, but they served their purpose, launching an unceasing barrage of plasma, missiles, and even acid at the Necron fleet. The lightning arcs lashed out as our distance dimmed, beginning a relentless assault interspersed with the occasional particle whip barrage. Some of my dozen smaller ships fell, but the Sovereign spat out 2 new ones for every one that got destroyed. Those particle whips had a charge-up time. I didn't. The star pulse generators fired in sequence, quick, undeniably powerful, and somehow more than they seemed. That plasma they released had no right being that vicious, that difficult to halt, or so dangerous. It must have been some strange Necron science, infusing the flames with the concept of destruction or entropy or some other technobabble nonsense. It didn't matter. A lesser psyker might have faltered, but with a tiche in my hand, they never even got close to overwhelming me. Still, they were yet another thing I had to split my focus and psychic power to counteract, leaving less to focus on counterattacking. The Regent seemed intent on keeping me from getting any breathing room. Too bad, he should have tried harder. I grinned, a tiche spinning at my side idly before I grabbed it, poured a tide of raw power into it, and let it rip forth. I didn't need much focus to just aim my staff in the direction of the enemy fleet. With enough power behind it, Eldritch Blast turned into a whomever it may concern in that general direction type of attack. Good thing the tomb ship was 15 kilometers across, it was hard to miss even with just a meager amount of focusing. A small star bloomed to life ahead of the Sovereign's prow, a tiny dot of brilliant light that hung there for a moment, and then it ripped forth. All the power I'd gathered and was still pouring into it exploded ahead with all the annoyance, frustration, and hate I felt, widening into a beam of crackling energy primed to erase all that stood in its way by the time it reached the Scythe-class harvest ship floating in front of the tomb ship. It happened in a fraction of a nanosecond, and the ship's shields held out for a respectable full second before they popped, generator fried by the overwhelming power they had to contend with. The beam swallowed the ship whole, then continued on unabated, crashing into the tomb ship like a battering ram. I saw its shields quiver, then hold and then even out in a moment, probably because more power was being channeled into the shield generators. It held, and I hummed, then grinned and swept a tiche sideways. The titanic beam of energy followed the motion, slipping off the tomb ship and tearing through space. Another scythe caught a grazing blow, and a third of the ship was utterly unmade, then the beam continued on, tearing through 3 smaller ships before I cut off the power with a gasp. "Mom?" Cat asked, squirming around to look at me with big, worried eyes. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said, panting slightly as I hit a wince. One of my soulbone bones had cracked, and my body was falling apart at the seams from the magnitude of energy I forced through it. Some of the pain reached me before I cut off my connection to my pain receptors. "I'm perfectly fine, though I may have gone a bit overboard." "You sure?" Kat asked, squinting at me suspiciously, but I just grinned and rubbed her head playfully, messing up her hair. "Woo? Hey. You don't need to worry about me, Kat," I said, patting her affectionately. "Though it is very much appreciated." "Anything permanent?" Celine asked telepathically. "I'll need to replace one of the bones in my forearm, nothing serious," I replied without letting anything show on my face. Of course, Celine somehow saw through me. "They are not retreating," Celine said thoughtfully, peering at the holographic command table depicting the 2 battling sides. It's probably a sunk cost fallacy kind of thing, I hummed, the majority of my mind focusing on optimizing the firing solutions of my endless number of weapons batteries. Or just ego. Their pride can't let them run away after I'd destroyed so many of their ships. You would think, being as old as they are, the Necrons would have learned to live today to fight another day, Celine said. Oh, they have, long ago, I said. Their phase tech is evidence of that. I'm not sure whether any of the Necrons I've killed are down for good. Most of them are probably already being remade in the depths of their tomb worlds. Besides, winning a war against a race of godlike beings, then enslaving your own gods does earn them the right to be prideful, methinks. The closer we got, the more an outing their lightning arcs became. Only scythes had star pulse generators, and even particle whips were only present on every other ship. But lightning arcs? Those even the smallest light cruisers had in spades. They were so fucking annoying. A particle whip slipped past my defenses, we were too close, and that fraction of a second I had to react had shrunk down to basically nothing. A deep gouge had been torn out of the Sovereign's side, a sizable crater left behind where the beam first hit. Then two more, then a third and a fourth. Each took large chunks of the Sovereign with it, the worst hit erasing a whole tenth of the ship and making me pull my command desk, along with every living creature on board, into the depths of the ship. 307, that's a little extreme. What are you going to do when I erase every single ship in your fleet aside from the tomb ship? I mused thoughtfully, my Sovereign drifting ever closer to the enemy fleet, the exchange of volleys intensifying ever more with every kilometer. I searched my memory, looking for whether anyone had ever boarded Necron ships, and found that only a teleportarium could get them through the energy shields Necron ships used. The Minotaurs had even boarded a tomb ship once, likewise by teleporting onto it in a last-ditch attempt to slay the Pharrian. Which would be impossible with that damn space-time dampener smothering space all across the star system. It was annoying. I wanted to try out my new boarding torpedoes. Let's stress test that bitch. I decided, once more drawing on my soul energy, which I then used to just hammer away at space-time. I didn't want to break through, all I wanted was to cause a disturbance, ripples and quakes that would reverberate across the fabric without damaging it. I wanted to see whether the space-time dampener could deal with it. Perhaps it could withstand singular, powerful efforts to pierce through the fabric, but what of sustained, weaker quakes that spread out across the entire star system? Did they have enough energy output, even with the TAN powering the ship to do that, and keep the energy shields fully powered as well? I channeled it all through a Tiche, adding its own power into the fold as it focused and enhanced my efforts. The power poured into my staff, then flashed out across the system, slamming into space itself. A smirk tugged at my lips when I felt it ripple, and I continued on, slam after slam, each timed perfectly to exacerbate the slight ripples, turning them into a steady wobble after 5, then a shake at 20 and an actual quake that was probably wreaking havoc across the entire system by the 50th strike. My soulbone skeleton was fraying, hairline cracks spreading across it as energy tore through them, and my body was in a constant state of flux. Organic bits liquefied only for me to hold them together by sheer force of will, then mend them back together. It was a constant effort, trying to keep my avatar from literally falling apart, but it was worth it. I felt it when it happened. A nanosecond after the 68th strike, the space-time dampener let up, its steadying influence reeled back in to cover only a smaller region 50,000 kilometers across with the Star Reaper at its center. Luckily, the Sovereign was inside it because the moment that superweapon let up, an apocalyptic storm of chaotic gravitational anomalies tore through the entire star system. It took about half an hour and drained an entire third of my soul energy reserves, while also costing me the integrity of my soulbone skeleton. But I had done it. It pushed me to the very limit of my psychic capabilities, to cause such destruction across an entire system, and it was only possible due to the space-time dampener, which had acted like a closed-off pressure valve, letting the force of my attack stack up and up before releasing it all at once to devastating effects. It wasn't what I did that directly caused such devastation, but the rebound when the space-time dampener finally gave way and all that built-up pressure exploded outwards in a single apocalyptic blast. I need to spend more time on the Witchblade project. I need to reverse engineer how that psychic matrix and runes work, then incorporate my own versions of both into my soulbone skeleton. If I could make it focus and compress my power, I could achieve more with less energy and spare my bones much of the strain. I wondered what I could achieve once I had succeeded, once my entire skeleton was woven through with those psychic focusing matrices and a tish was upgraded to be the equal of a force weapon. I wasn't sure, I couldn't be sure until I actually did it, but the mere idea sent a rush of thrill down my spine. I wanted to find out, and I was sure as hell going to do so. Even now, my avatar's energy throughput and ability to channel my soul's true psychic might were my greatest limiter. I'd been so proud of my current design back when I first made it, but now I knew there was still much that could be done to improve upon it. That discovery still filled me with a mix of excitement and relief. Excitement, because of course, and relief because it meant I could grow even more powerful, and that meant I might one day be actually able to change things in a way that actually mattered. It meant I could win. On the other hand, my efforts were all but worthless in my current situation. The space-time dampener was still active and still made it impossible to board the tomb ship by teleporting on board. I'd say it was an atrocious waste to pour so much energy into an attack that didn't really work out in the end, but it was really fucking cool. I mean, planets across the entire star system were being torn apart by gravitational storms and spatial anomalies. It was awesome. Inside my body, a film of carapace formed around all my bones, tightening and forcing them back into their proper shape. Cracked, fractured, or outright shattered into fragments as they were unable to support my body as they were. It was a temporary measure until I remade my entire skeleton, but it would do. It would be much harder to channel soul energy with them in this sorry state, and my psychic power output had probably dropped to a 20th of what it used to be at the start of the battle. I took my witchblade into my hand, grasping its long hilt tightly. It was a crutch, a weapon made by a race that couldn't channel even 1/100th of the energy their bodies could withstand in fear of drawing the gaze of she who thirsts. It was a weapon meant to sidestep that issue, a weapon used to channel the psychic might of its wielder directly, without the need to channel titanic amounts of energy through the body. The Grey Knights used Nemesis Force weapons for similar reasons. Their psychic potentials had been artificially raised well beyond what humans could bear. They couldn't channel all that power through their bodies either because the body would give out or their minds would, allowing them to be possessed. For them, too, force weapons were a nice way to leverage their powerful psychic might without the dangers of using it directly. It would do for me too. For now. I'd wanted to do this without making use of the weapon, it didn't feel like my own power, if that made sense. It used Eldari runes, it weaponized their great and ancient history, their own metaphysical weight upon the Empyrean. Though it was my soul that gave the seed from which it was born, and even though I forged it, it was still an Eldari weapon. It felt like borrowed power. I don't know why that annoyed and troubled me so much. Technically, my eldritch flesh and anything I'd gained through it were all borrowed power as well, but I felt like I had made it mine. I felt like everything I took with it, genetic templates and biomass alike, I had taken and made my own. The witchblade still didn't feel like it was mine. That was why I wanted to make my own runes, to make use of my own psychic might and metaphysical weight to power it, or perhaps humanity's as well. But it would do. For now. So this is how I'm going to die? Aboard a living, organic ship that exists in open defiance of everything that is good? Torn to shreds by a gravity storm brought about by the crazy witch that probably saw the Emperor in diapers? Is it truly how I die? Syafa's cane stared numbly out the window that wasn't truly a window. They were somewhere in the deepest part of the ship, surrounded by kilometers of tough flesh and carapace on all sides. The window was just a screen showing a visual feed, no matter how lifelike and authentic it seemed. This was how he died. Far away from the peaceful retirement he'd fought for all his life. No, even if he escaped, he would be forever barred from it in the future anyway. How was it again? Ah, yes, only in death does my duty end. He was an unaging, miniature custodian now, even if Echidna's false copy of His Divine Majesty's work was not truly equal to an original Adeptus Custodes, he would still live for centuries. If he couldn't die from old age, he just knew it in his bones that the top branch would try to get him killed in other ways, as they always did. Although now it wouldn't be due to their false belief in his divinely blessed status, but to get rid of an eyesore. Even if Amberley was right and Lord Octavian would lend his word and his support, he knew many would view him as an abomination now, a living, breathing act of absolute heresy. He still wasn't sure why he'd accepted the offer. That was a lie, he knew it to be a lie. Amberley had looked at him with those big blue eyes of hers, asked nicely and gave him a coy smile. He'd folded then and there. Yes, he was a coward. That was nothing new. He'd always been a coward, that was the only thing that kept him alive. A braver man wouldn't have survived the Schola Progenium, much less all the trouble he'd found himself in over the following centuries. Perhaps he could weasel his way into joining Amberley's retinue in a more permanent fashion? He had retired from the commissariat, he was no longer a member of the Imperial Guard either. He was technically a civilian, even though his military rank had never been officially removed. His crimson sash and cap were never taken from him, nor was his clearance level, so he was a commissar in all but name, even though he was technically in retirement. If they survived this mess, that is. Not something he was in any way certain of, quite the opposite, in fact. The world out there beyond this small bubble they occupied looked like hell itself. An entire star system was devastated, a dozen planets torn apart, their molten hearts scattered across the void of space, while the star itself at the core of the system was in the process of going supernova. How long would it be until its wrath swallowed them whole? Would they survive it? Would they survive the Necron's next attempt to slay them? A tomb ship. Amberley had spoken of them in hushed whispers, her face holding an unusual note of wariness and fear that he did not like one bit. If this is how I die, so be it. He thought, then grabbed the next bottle of delicious scotch he'd found in his room's mini fridge, pouring it over a cube of ice at the bottom of his glass. He may not have won that frog wager, but Echidna had surprised him by fulfilling his wish nonetheless. The next time he returned to his quarters, he'd found a new mini fridge freshly stocked with new brands and types of alcohol. Now if only he had a beautiful woman in his other hand while sipping his possible final drink. Alas, Amberley was a bit too preoccupied with staring at the battle maps and sensor feeds to serve the purpose, and the only other two women were not suitable. One was his host's lover, and the other was her daughter. His well-honed survival instincts told him he wouldn't live long enough for Amberley to divorce him of his balls before Echidna vented him into space if he tried his luck by flirting with either of them. Well, that just meant he had two hands to drink with instead of one. It streamlined the process, if nothing else. We're going to hit that tomb ship at this rate, he mused aloud, then took a good long sip of his drink. It burned all the way down his throat and into his belly, but left a lingering aftertaste that reminded him of good quality spiced honey. If he were to die today, he sure as hell wasn't going to die sober. It wasn't like there was anything he could do to better his chances at survival anyway, so sobriety would just bring down the mood without any benefit. It would not be easy, but he was determined to triumph over his custodian-grade alcohol, poison, resistance even if it required him to pour alcohol down his throat straight from the barrels. He could have prayed to the Emperor for salvation, but what for? The big man had seen fit to have him sitting on this ship, so the best he could hope for was that he'd be forgiven for all his cowardice when he was dumped before the Golden Throne for judgment. Well, at this rate, all that would be left of him to dump there were going to be his deatomized ashes, but oh well. That's the point, Echidna said with a grin that was all teeth and malice. Cain decided to do the smart thing and down the rest of his glass. Nope. Inner peace. Serenity. He was tranquility itself given form. And we are in range, do not leave this room. With that final order, she moved, and even with his supposedly custodian-grade enhanced senses, Cain could still barely catch the blur as she leapt through the ceiling. He was sure even an Astartes would have thought she'd just teleported with the speed at which she moved. His eyes watched the hole in the ceiling close swiftly, then his gaze swam back to the visual sensor feed displayed across the massive wall right in front of him. He watched as Echidna burst through the prow of the ship, that obnoxiously long Eldar greatsword of hers trailing behind her, held in a loose grip. Tendrils of entropic green energy lashed out at her, but they missed time and again as she twisted and turned, likely also using psyker nonsense to push them aside. Then she reached the tomb ship barely half a second after she'd left the room. Kane saw the energy shields thrum, shimmering in the darkness with a light greenish hue, just short of translucent. The witchblade swung in a wide arc, coming down in a titanic overhead slash at the colossal wall of raw energy. He didn't expect much. He'd just spent minutes watching warheads that had ravaged entire worlds and devastated entire hive ships do nothing against that shield. In all honesty, despite everything he had seen, he was expecting the sword to bounce off the shield, for a tendril of energy to swat Echidna aside and then for another of those horrifying beams to tear through the sovereign. He raised his glass, once more carrying that rich golden liquid, and he swallowed it all down in a single gulp after toasting his supposed host. It had been a good run. The energy shield split, a vicious jagged wound hundreds of meters long appeared upon its surface, and Kane's latest drink nearly filled his lungs instead of his stomach as his eyes flew wide open. Then he promptly devolved into a hacking fit of coughs, trying not to die or cough up his lungs. 308, riposte. I only had a tiny window I could use, just a brief instant between the tomb ship's energy shield getting torn to a new asshole and the phase-out contingency activating. Something in my bones told me that even if the captain of this vessel was willing to sacrifice lesser ships in hopes of slaying me, the moment he himself came under real danger, he'd waste no time escaping. So I didn't stop to charge up an attack or send myself into the ship like a missile. I lashed out again with my blade, tearing a long, jagged wound upon the necrodermis hull of the ship. Then a tish slammed into my palm, and a beam of energy bored into the wound, deepening it until I could see an open space on the other side. The moment before the ship phased out of existence, a single draugr launched itself out of my body, through that hole and into the ship. When the ship fizzled out of existence like a bad mirage a brief instant later, I couldn't help but grin despite the fact that my quarry had managed to run away again. Why? Because that draugr had been carrying a beacon I could still fairly sense at the edges of my perception. I had a direction and a rough distance, perfect for triangulation. I wasn't sure how long that single drone would last, even though it was my most powerful and latest direct combat design. Not that it mattered, it just needed to last long enough. I blinked back onto the Sovereign's command deck just as the cataclysmic gravitational storms all around us rushed in to consume our little bubble of safety. Without the space-time dampener, nothing was stopping them, but with it gone, nothing was stopping me either from teleporting away. Which is exactly what I did. The Sovereign skittered across the veil, on that thin fabric of in-between that separates what is from what isn't. It slammed back into real space a dozen light-years away, and my mind cores jolted again at the inflow of data, combined it with what I'd gathered before, and a second later, I had the approximate spatial coordinates of the hollow sun. At least, I hoped it was the hollow sun where that tomb ship had escaped to, because I was really aching for a prize that couldn't run away by now. And a simple tomb world just wouldn't cut it after I had my prey slip through my fingers so many times. Now I knew where their base of operation was. If I attacked them there, they couldn't run away. Maybe there would be a dolmen gate that allowed a few of them to escape, but the ships? The throne world itself? Those wouldn't be going anywhere. It would be disappointing, but there would be enough consolation prizes to make up for it. However, I realized it would be better to go alone. Had I not been worried about my guests and family on the Sovereign, it would have been me slipping inside that tomb ship. But if I did that, the Sovereign would have been left behind to weather the gravitational storms and spatial anomalies. Maybe the barriers would have held up, maybe it would have come out unscathed, and none of them would have been hurt. Maybe. But maybe wasn't good enough when it came to Celine and Kat's safety. Which was why they would be staying behind in an interstellar place, hidden aboard the Sovereign. Throughout this entire fight, having to keep the sepulchre's effects off of them had been the thing holding me back the most after the space-time dampener. I could have just torn through the tomb ship with my witchblade, but that would have left them undefended, so I had to wait until I could get the ship close enough that I could do both. I could maybe stomach taking Celine, she was stubborn, willful, and a reasonably powerful psyker. She'd likely be able to shrug off psychic effects with little effort. But not my guests and Kat. With that decided, the Sovereign started shifting again, warping back into the stealth template I'd made, and another teleport took it back into the desolate Freya system. There, I used the trick those sneaky Tyranids did and the ship was inside a massive hollow asteroid inside the dense Oort cloud surrounding the star system. It would remain as hidden there as reasonably possible. Still, I left it on high alert and ready to respond to any hostile force showing up. I even popped down a few void krakens nearby on the off chance that anyone came to investigate what the massive surge of psychic power in this dead system was. With those monsters and a quarter of my bioenergy reserves left behind for an emergency to be used freely, they should be fine. The odds of anyone trying to gank them are low, but not zero. Never zero. I left Kat as the admin of the ship while the onboard mind cores downloaded into the organic cogitators would handle the actual tasks. She'd be the acting captain, though, and just to be safe, I teleported her into another safe room far away from the bridge where my guests would be. I trusted them not to try anything stupid while I was there, but leaving harmless little Catherine right in front of them, who held the controls of the Sovereign in her hands, might prove to be a bit too tempting for the Imperials. A quick flash of telepathy informed both her and Celine about what I'd done and my plans for what was to follow. They both responded expectantly. My daughter promised to look after the ship, while Celine confirmed that she'd like to tag along if I would have her. I spent a few hours remaking my entire soulbone skeleton, pushing a tiny bit more of my own essence into the material as I brought it into existence. It was a slow, draining process. The art of making soulbone, originally called wraithbone, was called bonsinging, but it rarely involved any actual singing. According to Val, you had to make your soul sing, pour it into the wraithbone. For some, that was most easily done by singing beautiful Eldari melodies and ballads about their history, heart-wrenching songs that resonated deeply with their own souls and emotions. When emotions flowed freely, and the soul itself sang with them, only then could most bonesingers craft wraithbone. It was a dangerous art, considering Eldar felt every emotion more intensely than humans, and letting themselves actually feel again was always a danger. She who thirsts was the prince of excess, and it was oh so easy for the less experienced bonesingers to let themselves feel too much. They always danced right along the edge of excess. That was where their art was the most powerful and where their greatest works came from. They could make do with fewer emotions, play things carefully, but that produced subpar wraithbone. It would work, but it would be no powerful relic, no artifact fit to be wielded by a phoenix lord. Those were born when their makers danced at the edge of ruin. My first skeleton was made when I barely understood those concepts and the art itself. The path of shaping was deep and dangerous, and I didn't even have a surface-level understanding back then. I just brute-forced it with sheer willpower and psychic might. Turning every single bone in my body into a force weapon was out of the question, but I could do better now. I spent those few hours swimming in my emotions, letting my mind and soul experience them in their entirety. I had lots of able material for intense emotions: my love for Celine, Kat, and my other daughters, my fear of losing them, my pride at seeing them grow, my grief and rage at humanity's wretched state, my hope for a better future. My soul sang, its discordant song ringing out across my realm as I poured soul energy into real space, and it took shape. The slivers of my soul's own essence that flowed into my avatar were the seed, and the soul energy was the nourishment. From them grew bones, one after the other, vibrant and strong, still echoing my soul's discordant song even as I finally finished it hours after I first began. I had a feeling I'd fucked up somehow by channeling so many conflicting emotions. That song should have been a symphony of a dozen resonant songs coming together into a greater whole. It was not, but it would do for now. My next work will be better. I'd already sacrificed a week's worth of soul growth on this, so I wasn't about to throw it out in the garbage. Once it was inside my body, I threw the old, cracked and partially shattered skeleton into my realm, leaving it to dissolve or just float around as it wished. Maybe I'd use it as a demon lore if it refused to dissolve. After that, Celine joined me through a portal, already decked out in full gear and her mind thrumming with psychic power just like Val had taught her. Hopefully, it would be enough to ward off any psychic attacks. Ready? I asked, my voice traveling through the void of space by sheer willpower despite the impossibility of it. Celine just nodded seriously, her burgeoning thrill of excitement tempered by years of combat experience. I could feel her mind, body, and even soul all harden, tensing up in preparation. The first teleport sent us a dozen light-years away, well into the Slender Drift star cluster. I reoriented myself, breathing a brief sigh of relief when I found the beacon still going strong, then ran some quick calculations to narrow down the exact star that had to be hiding the hollow sun inside its empty core. The next teleport narrowed it down to 4, the one after that to 3, and the next one after that finally gave me a single star system. It was extremely energy intensive, but it was worth it when I earned time in return. In front of us was a rather mundane-looking star system with 5 planets orbiting the local primary star. I stared at it for a moment, my body slightly unwinding to expose 100 different types of sensors to observe and analyze the star. It was an orange dwarf, a K-type main sequence star according to Earth's classifications. It was roughly 0.8 solar radius, 0.6 solar mass heavy, and just marginally dimmer than Sol. The surface temperature was also maybe 4 to 5,000 kelvins, 20 to 30% cooler than Earth's surface. At first glance, its gravitational well, mass and other such things matched up to expectations. To a superficial survey and observation, it really was just a regular orange dwarf star. Nothing extraordinary beyond the fact that such stars were the most stable ones and most suited to support life on the planets orbiting them. It was when my senses burrowed deep and brushed upon what should have been the core of the star that the strangeness began. There was a kilometer-thick layer of stellar core where nuclear fusion occurred under extreme pressure, but beneath that? I didn't know. I couldn't tell. Not with my sensors and not with my aura, it was just a void of nothingness that I would have believed to be due to the immense gravitational pressure in the core of a star, were it not for my aura. All my other senses gave back largely expected, for a regular star, readings, but my aura just went dark, cut off very suddenly and unable to feel a single thing inside the core. It wasn't rocket science to figure out that there had to be something fucky with the perfectly spherical void. Still, sneaky Necrons, they sure as hell went above and beyond with this thing. A Dyson sphere like Trajan's Solomnance was one thing, humans even in my time theorized that it was possible, but hollowing out a star's core and building a world inside? I felt my lips curl into a grin as I stared into the star, space bending around me. What had been a distant dot of light amidst a sea of deep darkness became a titanic ocean of fire and heat. Waves of molten plasma the size of mountains roiled and clashed across a landscape of liquid fire stretching on and on seemingly without an end. I couldn't hear the sound it made, there was no atmosphere on a star, but I felt the weight of the planet. I felt each crashing wave of plasma large enough to bury the Himalayas in my bones. There was something awe-inspiring about something so massive, something so dangerous and wonderful that even all my new powers couldn't dim. I dismissed that thought with a shrug, refocusing and trying to find a way the space-time dampener was inactive. Space was denser here, tougher and more resistant to manipulation, but it lacked that artificial smoothness. So with a single teleport, we zipped past hundreds of kilometers of thick plasma, and I felt like someone grabbed me mid-transit and yanked me off my chosen path, pulling me towards a specific spot inside the hollow sun. Maybe I'd have allowed it once, but I was wary of the Necrons and their tricks. I fought it, wiggling out of that grip just enough to displace myself a few hundred meters away from the spot the weird pull was trying to take me. Must have been a teleportation countermeasure. Let the stupid teleporters think they could sneak inside and bypass the security, only for them to end up in a kill zone or in a cell prepared to neutralize them. Nasty. Anyone else would have been helpless against the pull. Teleportation took mere nanoseconds, and that pull latched onto me in the last moment of even that tiny timeframe. Even my own perception speed had to be sped up near the limit of what my avatar could bear to slip free of the trap. Nasty indeed. I took in our new surroundings in an instant, my senses and perception unfolding to map the place. My aura was still suppressed, stifled to the point that it was life covering my skin and barely able to push a few inches beyond it, so I was left using mundane avenues of perception. Large empty hall, high ceiling, dreary necrodermis constructs, and monolithic brutalist architecture. The darkness was broken up only by lines of eerie green energy flowing in rivets, and the silence was interrupted only by the distant clanging of metallic feet on the stone floor. The walls were difficult to penetrate, but echolocation, combined with some of my more unusual senses, allowed me to create a reasonably accurate 3D map of the surrounding halls and the twisting tunnels linking them. I had a spherical map with us at the center and nearly 2 kilometers across diagonally. The map clearly showed a horde of Necron warriors marching towards us from every tunnel leading to the hall we crash-landed in. Well, it seems like they've sent a welcoming party. How nice of them. 309, Ahatek's Lamentations. Ahatek remained still as a statue, his unliving metallic form becoming one with the unchanging architecture of the Star Reaper's command deck. The twin orbs of lifeless green light burning in his metallic skull were dim, yet focused on the images playing out before them. He had run, retreated, and withdrawn. Scurried away like a rat. Escaped like a beaten mutt. He had given the order just moments ago, mere moments, and despite his mind being a supremely advanced computer able to process data at an immense pace, he couldn't quite come to terms with it. He had run. From a single ship, no, from a single creature. He pulled up the image captured by the visual sensors at the prow of the tomb ship, just staring at what kind of creature was that? It had 2 legs, a torso, 2 grasping upper limbs with opposable thumbs and a head. It looked vaguely similar to an Eldari, even if its facial structure was off and its form was a bit too short and stocky. A mutant? No, there was no way the Eldari would mutate, the old ones weren't that sloppy with their creations. Whatever it was, it showed up on the Empyrean energy sensors as an extremely high-density, high-potency signature. The analytics came in, and based on ancient data from the War in Heaven, the cryptex placed this creature's danger level somewhere on the level above a powerful Eldari warlock but below their make-believe gods. And yet its blade tore through the tomb ship's energy shield like it wasn't even there. How was that possible? The Star Reaper had withstood direct assault from star gods. Ahatek knew for a fact it had been there when the Burning One fell and was torn apart. It had been there when the Void Dragon had been sundered, and it was also present when the Deceiver finally received its comeuppance. How did a single creature less outwardly powerful than a weak Eldari god born of that make-believe realm tear through that? How? The eerie screech of metal on metal echoed in the deathly silent hall as Ahatek's fingertips dug grooves into the armrests of his throne, liquid fury overwhelming his core matrices for a moment. How dare that creature? How does it dare take what was his by right? His ships, his precious, mighty ships. Gone. Barely half of what he'd taken into battle returned. Half. How? It was impossible, incomprehensible, unacceptable. It shouldn't have happened. It never should have happened. Why didn't it just die like it was supposed to? Why? 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 His ships were gone, so many of them erased in an instant, and there wasn't even anything to recover. But worse than that was the loss of cryptex. He had so precious few of them, just a few dozen across the entire hollow sun, and he'd lost 15 of them. If only he had at least managed to kill that creature, erase the threat it posed, maybe then, it didn't matter. That was why he'd stayed even when that ridiculous Empyrean superweapon unleashed that energy beam and tore apart so many of his ships. The threat that the enemy ship posed had been made abundantly clear then, and he needed it gone. It had to be erased even if it cost him every ship in his fleet besides the Star Reaper. It would have still been an outrageously costly endeavor, but it would have been worth it in the end. Then it cut through the Star Reaper's shield, and suddenly, he wasn't so sure about his victory over the enemy being inevitable. He had panicked. He couldn't lose this ship, it was his greatest weapon. He just couldn't. Overlord Regent. One of his cryptex stepped forward, bowing lowly before his throne. Nihei, one of Oskin's many pupils, was left in his care for this excursion while the codifier remained behind to make sure the Crown World continued operating on optimal parameters while he was away. What is to be done about the infiltrator? Ahatek paused. Infiltrator. What infiltrator? His senses swept out, pouncing on the pile of unread alerts that he had ignored in his frothing rage. He tore through them in his mind and paused, going deathly still again as he found the reports detailing the infiltrator's actions and advance. It had slipped in through the gap made by that psyker that tore through the shield, but it wasn't the psyker itself. Whether that was a blessing or a curse, he couldn't rightly tell with the data he had on hand. He was back in the hollow sun, the tomb ship docked inside the artificial planet's massive dockyards. There was no escaping from here without using a dolmen gate, but a powerful enough saboteur could easily cause massive damage to the still mostly slumbering Crown World if it managed to slip away and disappear into its labyrinthine hallways and tunnels. Ahatek did not have the manpower needed to do a thorough sweep of the entire world, not even close. He might never catch this creature if it slipped out of the Star Reaper. Permission granted to direct half of my Lich Guards into battle, Ahatek said, his voice deathly still in a way that all who knew him would know meant he was absolutely livid inside. And 10 death marks as well, along with a regular legion of immortals. Find this creature, kill it, and send its corpse to Oscan for study if possible. It should have been a simple affair. From what little he saw of the infiltrator on sensors, it was some manner of organic war beast with bodily proportions similar to a Necron, just made of weak flesh and bone. It had no ranged weapons and wielded only its claws as melee weapons, or bludgeoned the occasional patrol it ran into with its limbs. A single proper hit from a Gauss Flayer would have killed it, and even a grazing hit should have crippled it long enough to get a few proper hits in, even if the shooter was a mindless Necron with only targeting algorithms to guide their aim instead of a thinking mind. A single grazing hit, that was all he needed. He dispatched his elite assassins and bodyguards, along with the immortals. He should have received word of the infiltrator's death within minutes. He did not, in fact, receive word of such a thing coming to pass, even as the minutes flowed by and an entire hour had gone by. The infiltrator was running around, leading its pursuers on a wild chase across the tomb ship. The fact that Ahatek had barely enough Necrons on board to even call it a skeleton crew once again came back to haunt him as the fast-moving irritant easily moved through the unoccupied parts of the ship without anyone there to contest it or cut it off. He didn't even have that many troops on board, and why would he? What use were immortals or destroyers in a void battle? He considered giving in to his base impulse, letting his rage control him and do as it implored him to do, go out there and strangle this vermin with his own 2 hands. Alas, the absolute indignity of an overlord regent having to chase around a single trespasser himself eclipsed that of having the trespasser run circles around his troops. Worse, what if he failed to catch it in a speedy manner? What if he were forced to give up? Oh, the indignity of the mere thought of that happening to him filled him with so much rage and shame in equal parts that he just simmered in those emotions for a while. For as long as Ahatek could remember, he had always detested having to get his own hands dirty. He was an overlord, a commander, not some lowly warrior to wade into battle and swing his warglaive around. So he pressed that urge to rush out and do exactly that into the furthest reaches of his mind, regaining some focus by sheer will. Ahatek had not been some no-name overlord from some inconsequential planet conquered by the dynasty. No, he had been a part of Farian Amenteca's court since before biotransference. His rivals in the court had been numerous back then, and he'd been just a lowly vizier. By the time the war in heaven was concluded, he was Farian's most influential courtier, second only to Oscan the Codifier, the ancient cryptech who was the only one the Crimson Scythe tolerated criticism from. He was no military genius, not when compared to the Farian, but his mind had beaten some of the dynasty's best and brightest in centuries-spanning games of deception and scheming. He used all his experience to craft traps and herd the infiltrator where he needed it to be for ambushes, all of which escalated in complexity as the vexatious creature kept either evading them or breaking straight through them. By the time the 5th hour passed with the infiltrator still at large, Ahatek felt like he was about to fall to the Flayer virus or the Destroyer curse from sheer rage and frustration any minute now. But of course, that was when he received another piece of news. The dimensional corridor subversion array has triggered, my Lord Regent, the same cryptech as before informed him, head bowed low. Ahatek wasn't listening, already looking into the matter. He had received an alert the moment it happened, but he needed a few seconds to grasp the implications, to understand what it meant. The would-be trespasser has been rerouted to the eradication zone. Correction. It successfully slipped free and displaced itself to appear in the hall next to the eradication zone. The eradication zone in question was on the Hollow Sun proper, but thanks to the Farian's perfectionism and foresight, it didn't rely on a single line of defense. Even if a trespasser somehow escaped the room, the subversion array should have dumped them in. The entire area around it was built like an extremely defensible containment zone. Almost like a fortress with 3 different circles of walls around it that defended against something trying to break out from the innermost part, instead of the other way around, like regular forts. The enemy was still boxed in and primed for an ambush. He just Had to swiftly transport some troops there because his awake and cognizant Necron foot soldiers were on the other side of the artificial planet. Troublesome. At least he still had 3 legions of immortals standing guard there, along with a single legion of destroyers. He also had a few legions of regular Necron warriors, but they were pitiful, not even a sliver of sentience to be found in their minds. They were mindless automatons in truth and required the direct attention of tactical cryptechs or technomancers to be able to put up much of a fight against anything that was a true threat. Considering how irritatingly fast the first infiltrator was, no mindless automaton was ever going to hit it, or the second group of trespassers, even if he threw hundreds of them at the targets. Immortals at least had a chance, however small, but it was death marks that he was trusting to finish them in the end. That is Ahatek said, wishing he could breathe so he might sigh. Alas, his metallic ribcage failed to expand, and his body had no lungs to draw air in with. Quite vexing. 2 infiltrators in a single day. Ahatek paused, a brief glimmer of glee shining through his core matrices as a part of his prodigious mind watched as the first infiltrator finally fell. Just as he had expected, it was a death mark that delivered the final blow, though it took some rather complex planning to push the aggravating creature into a corner and force it to take the damned entropic beam in the chest. Still, it was just a single trespasser, and he now had to deal with 2 more. But he had experience now, he had data, he knew what to expect. These new annoyances would fall much more quickly. It would appear the second one had been using the first one as a targeting beacon to aim an artificially manifested Empyrean teleportation phenomenon, the cryptech said. It would also appear to be that this new uninvited guest is the same one who had attacked the Star Reaper. Suddenly, Ahatek wasn't so sure that the 4 legions he had standing guard would be enough to keep the trespasser contained, even though they had the absolute terrain advantage. They are coming, I said as my primary thought stream slowed back down to something merely superhuman. I turned to Celine, finding a small grin tugging at her lips despite the focused look in those beautiful steel gray eyes of hers. Then let's kill them, she replied, her voice nearly a purr or maybe a growl. Still, it sent a delicious shiver down my spine. I nodded with a grin at her sagely advice, my own power armor unfolding around me and melding with my body. I didn't need skin, just extra muscles connecting to my avatar and an armored carapace above it. The surface of my carapace separated into layers, leaving microscopic films of air between them. According to my experiments, that would keep the Gauss flares from affecting my entire body at once, instead attacking layer by layer. We exploded into action as one. Our telepathic link was deeper by now than catching mere surface-level thoughts we projected at each other. Intent was what we exchanged through it now, and we exchanged it freely, moving as one as we dashed down a bend and came upon a marching line of Necron warriors in the cavernous hallway. We didn't slow down, quite the opposite. Bioenergy burned in our bodies as we turned into twin missiles, blades infused with psychic power, slashing out around us. Green beams of death lashed out, a deep resonant thrum filling the space, echoing off the tall walls. Blades moved like flowing water, from one motion to the next, as we danced through the mob of enemies. They were so slow, so simple, each of their movements was robotic, all their actions predictable. We twisted and dashed around each beam, tearing through their ranks, only stopping once all that remained in the hallway was scrap metal. We didn't stop, Celine following along as I rushed ahead, giving her a bit of a mental tug to urge her to hurry along. We needed to be quick if we wanted to break out of this encirclement. I could feel heavy weaponry moving all around us, and I didn't want to get boxed in by a bunch of desperate Necrons. The moment they started to feel cornered would be the most dangerous. I knew Necrons had some nasty tricks, ancient relics that could do some ridiculous things. Like the celestial aura that could detonate stars from across the galaxy, the miniature rings that held the power of a supernova inside them, and so on and so forth. The regent needed to die before he could authorize the use of some of the more extreme toys the Crimson Scythe must have had lying around in his vault. 310, scheming, plotting, vibing. I was being watched. I could feel it in my bones, an inexplicable tension that tightened in my shoulders, in the strange chill that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. That by itself wasn't worrying. I was used to being watched, to being observed. What concerned me was that I couldn't for the love of me find out how or from where I was being watched. There were no cameras, no sneaky canoptech spiders, wraiths, or other such Necron constructs. The last group of regular Necron warriors lay at my feet in a pile of scrap metal, all of them thoroughly destroyed to make absolutely sure they had no more sensors that someone could use to watch me. Honestly, it wasn't that surprising. Technology was probably a weakness of mine, from a certain perspective. I couldn't sense the energy Necrons used to fuel their gadgets as clearly as I could perceive warp energy. I didn't even know what to look for, and even if I found it, I had no clue how to deduce the tech's purpose. I knew some basic stuff about Necron tech, but far from enough to find whatever went beyond top-of-the-line spyware and intelligence-gathering technology. Hell, I couldn't even stop them from doing that annoying phase-out trick of theirs. Yet. I paused, blinking slowly as that thought churned in my head. That's it, isn't it? Extra dimensions. Their phase technology makes use of pocket spaces and extra purely physical dimensions untouched by the warp. Whatever is watching me, it's using one of those to hide the tech, or maybe they are there themselves, hiding in a pocket space. Death marks, of fucking course. How could I forget about death marks? Elite Necron sniper assassins that could make use of pocket spaces to hide phased out in a space and observe their prey. They could also use some weird dimensional fuckery to teleport around. Other than that, they had one of the most sadistic and nasty weapons of all of Warhammer 40k, synaptic disintegrators. Technobabble I could remember from the wiki page I've read in my last life. These cruel long-barreled rifles fire compressed leptonic beams of subatomic particles which destroy neural and synaptic tissue. Beginning within the target's brain and spreading in microseconds throughout their entire body, molecules unbond with one another, causing the luckless target to crumple limply to the ground as a puppet with its strings severed. Even if the first shot doesn't kill you, even if it's just a grazing shot that barely touches your skin, it will fry a part of your neural tissue, aka your brain, and tear apart your mind, leaving you as a vegetable. Luckily, I didn't really need my brain to think anymore. It boosted my cognitive speed and processing capacity, and could house my mind with less lag, but in the end, it was non-essential. It was just a server farm supporting the main computer, my true mind, tied to my soul. Celine, though, she'd be fine. Probably. Hopefully. She had a black box too, and she should be able to both predict, dodge and tank a shot. Yeah, it was fine. But just to be sure I reached out with a thread of psychic power from my soul, reaching for Celine's soul housed safely within my realm, and I wrapped her mind in a protective cocoon. What? She gave me a questioning look, sensing that I had just done something. Just a mind shield, an extra layer of security, I said. Don't worry. It should be fine either way, just don't get hit. Thank you, Celine said, her voice tinged with wry amusement. I will try to follow your enlightening advice. Right, don't get hit wasn't exactly a groundbreaking new strategy. I added a clarification over our telepathic link: we have a death mark on our tail. Even if you survive a hit from their weapon, you won't enjoy it. I don't enjoy getting shot in general, Celine said, though I could feel that she had taken me seriously. It was hard not to when she felt my own genuine worry for her well-being. But I'll be careful. I nodded, and we finally came upon one of the massive blast doors locking us into this section of the Necron building complex. This hollow sun was absolutely massive, just tunnels and hallways, and halls and corridors stacked on top of and next to each other endlessly. Alien machinery whirled in some of them, others stored things I could make no sense of, while most were empty and decidedly designed in a way to make for a perfect choke point to defend against an enemy force. Too bad they only had two small groups of Necron warriors try to make use of them to stop our advance so far. Honestly, this place reminded me more of the Death Star from Star Wars than anything else, with the added Necron flair and their characteristic monolithic architecture. We slowed to a stop before the monolithic bulkhead that stood taller than some 5-story buildings and glimmered with the unmistakable greenish hue of a Necron force field. The cavernous hall we were in was a vast open space stretching in all directions for more than 100 meters, with the ceiling even higher than the bulkhead's top. My eyes snapped between the dozens of suspicious obelisk-like protrusions scattered across the wall surrounding the shut gateway, and then I narrowed my eyes as I felt the telltale tingle of gathering energy inside them. Yeah, those were immobile versions of the Necron monoliths, which themselves were mobile fortresses outfitted with particle whips. At the same time that happened, space shuddered behind us in the corridor we'd come from, and then with a crackle of unliving green energy, an eternity gate opened up between two standing obelisks. Those constructs had looked like innocuous parts of the architecture before, looking for all intents and purposes like stylized pillars acting as doorframes for the corridor, but now they cracked with power. From the green portal that bloomed into existence, Necrons marched forth, their eyes burning with the same unliving green light behind their skeletal masks, but more worryingly, glimmering with a shred of true intelligence. Their metallic necrodermis frames also looked more elaborate and robust, able to withstand much more punishment and exert greater power before giving out. Immortals, I hummed, a tish slamming into my open palm while the storm ward embedded into the chest of my armor near where my collarbones met thrummed with power. I'll handle the weapons batteries. Celine sent a note of acknowledgement through our link before snapping into a dead sprint in an instant. She moved so fast she might as well have teleported where a regular human was concerned, and she was in the midst of the marching formation of immortals in a blink, her bones word cleaving through 3 of them in a single swing. She'll handle them just fine. I tapped a tish on the ground, and the tiny clink of wood touching metal echoed strangely in the large open space. It should have gotten lost in the din of the battle taking place behind me, and yet it did not. It was like reality itself acknowledged its importance. For the moment, the staff made contact with the floor, and psychic power rippled forth. It rushed over the floor, leapt up the walls and reached the lowest pair of protruding monoliths just barely starting to glow in that eerie greenish hue of theirs. The psychic force that struck the monolith was a composite spell, technomancy to seek out its weakest points and tear into it with electromagnetic force, then telekinesis for brute physical force, and a bit of pyromancy, because even if all else failed, turning the construct into molten slag would likely prevail. I've come up with this trick for a moment like this, a time when I had to dismantle some advanced piece of extremely lethal technology aimed at me. I hadn't spent the last few weeks traveling between planets just lazing about or cuddling with Celine, after all, no matter how much I would have loved to. I watched as the technopathic pulse swept through the structure, not finding so much as a crack. It didn't matter, though, as this monolith had a much weaker force field to protect it than the tomb ship or even lesser Necron ships. The telekinetic force slammed into it, tearing through the fragile shield and then ripping the entire monolith off the wall, sending it crashing into the floor dozens of meters away. The ripple spread and crawled further up the wall, tearing through monolith after monolith in just a second. Not a single one of them had the time to fully power up, being torn away from their power lines before their particle whips could fire. Sure, these weren't the Starship-grade designs but miniaturized versions of the mobile weapons platforms that were monoliths, but they'd still have been an absolute pain to be hit by. And now they are scrap. I hummed, spinning back around, ignoring the colossal wall behind me that now sported a dozen gaping craters crackling with green energy where the monoliths used to be. Celine was still tearing through the veritable legion of immortals, dashing around among the now spread-out crowd of Necrons while they fired at her relentlessly. The characteristic low thrum of Gauss weapons firing in tandem filled the cavernous hall, the green light of their snapping energy beams illuminating the gloomy space and casting hundreds of crawling shadows. It looked like a ferocious fight where both sides fought with everything they had, putting their lives on the line to murder their opponent. A small army against a single woman who was an army unto herself. It didn't make sense that they'd be evenly matched, and they weren't. I knew Celine was just playing with them, or rather, studying her opponents. She did say that she had barely any experience fighting against Necrons, so maybe I should have expected this. My eyes narrowed as I felt a strange film of energy wrap around her body. It wasn't psychic in nature, not born of the warp at all, and yet it was so subtle I might not have noticed it had I not been paying so much attention. A moment later, a similar film tried to wrap around me as well, but an omnidirectional blast of soul energy tore it to shreds. Deathmark. I thought, my senses sharpening as I forced them into overdrive by pouring copious amounts of bioenergy into the associated organs. That must have been a deathmark marking us for death. If it had stuck, the assassin would have been able to track me and see me through all obstacles for an hour, no matter how far I escaped and what I put between it and myself. I tapped Atish on the ground and tore apart the mark sticking to Celine as well, and I reacted in an instant, the ground cratering beneath my feet as I kicked off and launched myself into the air. I crossed 100 meters to the top of a pillar holding up the distant ceiling in a mere moment, my staff ripping through the air and making contact with the metallic head emerging from a green portal. I saw the single ocular on its skeletal face mask widen, then shatter as Atish crashed into its faceplate, delivering enough telekinetic force to level a city block straight into its head. Predictably, the Necron was torn to shreds, and its weird pocket space portal vanished, taking the better part of its body with it to who knows where. How did the saying go? If you have the misfortune to catch a glimpse of a death mark, then there are 5 more currently lining up shots to kill you. My lips peeled back, my pearly white teeth glimmering in the low light in an expression only a madman would call a smile. Well, time to play some high-stress whack-a-mole with some of the galaxy's best assassins. Oscan the Codifier, highest-ranking cryptech of the Subakar dynasty and once the most trusted confidant of the Farian Amentek, stood stock still in his secret laboratory deep within the bowels of the hollow sun. He had thought he would have a bit more time just for himself without that overbearing regent taking up his precious time with inane tasks better left for lesser minds. He needed peace and time for his research, but with the regent hurrying him to personally help with the awakening protocols to speed up the process, he had only stolen moments and, at most, a few hours or days at a time. All around him were cells, numerous specimens fit for research locked behind semi-transparent green energy shields. Most were alive, some were not, but those latter ones were tied down to operating tables waiting for dissection, currently locked under a stasis field to stop them from decaying. Flesh and blood bodies rotted away in a blink if one wasn't careful. It was an annoyance to be sure, but not one he couldn't work around. His single eye turned to stare down at the wretched creature fixed to the operating table before him. Bands of green energy wrapped around the creature's limbs, its waist and its mouth. This one was promising to be yet another disappointment, this human, but Oscan was thorough if nothing else. He wouldn't dismiss an examination process halfway through just because he suspected the final results. He may stumble upon something interesting. Alas, this time was different. Something much more interesting was waiting for his attention, so he waved a clawed metallic hand over the struggling creature. A wave of chronomancy washed over its body, freezing it in place and locking it in that single moment where its torso was cut open and bloodshot eyes glared up at him in hatred, pain, and fear. He turned his attention back to the ocular feed he'd hijacked. Every Necron he personally awoke, or bound to the regent, he maintained a link to that allowed him to tap into their memory cortexes and their sensor logs. Now, he swiftly devoured dozens of visual logs of immortals, death marks, and even Lichguard chasing around a single strange creature for hours on end. Oscan tilted his head despite himself, the dreadfully disappointing research specimens in his lab forgotten as he analyzed this strange creature that ran circles around some of the best the Necron had. It was fast, faster than an overlord, its reflexes rivaled that of a Lichguard and its power, that was, respectable as well. His prodigious mind ran through analytical algorithms, then ran simulation after simulation. In his mind, a simulacra of this creature fought dozens of different Lichguard, overlords, and cryptechs he had adequate data on. It performed adequately, better than anything he had run through those same simulations before. Better than even his previous prime specimen, an Adeptus Astartes. The thing holding his research back the most was the fact that he had no access to live Astartes, only dead ones, and dissecting a corpse could only tell him so much. He needed a live specimen to be certain of his conclusion. That only a body equal to, or superior to, a Necron overlord's body of unliving metal could ever hope to house their minds. Out of every specimen he'd examined so far, only an Astartes body might have sufficed, but this creature. This was even better. It might be worthy of becoming the vessel of the Farian. Once the Crimson Scythe is free of his prison of metal, he shall rise once more as the Lord of the Subakar and depose this aggravating Ahatak. Then, the galaxy will learn to fear the name of our dynasty once more, and I will have a proper lord to serve after so dreadfully long instead of this imbecile. He simply had to capture that creature alive. It could change everything. It was this accursed metallic shell that drove the Farian mad, but once he had a mortal body of flesh and blood, he would surely recover his mental faculties in a timely manner. He had to, or all would be lost. 311, an oopsie. Necrons really were in a league of their own, I had to admit. The one time I let myself be hit by those nasty double-barreled gas blasters, it atomized 3 layers of my chidness armor. The same armor I've stress-tested against the Swarmlord's Bonesword and the Grey Knight's Force weapons. Sure, those cut deeper, but they were exotic relic gear, while there were hundreds of Necrons in the Force that came to slay us armed with gas blasters. The type of weaponry that other species considered top of the line and only armed the best of their elites with, the Necrons gave to their foot soldiers because they had billions upon billions of them sitting in dusty old storage rooms scattered across hundreds of tomb worlds. A well-placed or lucky shot from these could kill a space marine, and even when they were being wielded by Necron warriors, it was inevitable that one would get lucky when hundreds of them fired at once. Not that it was much of a trouble for me, as the psychic barrier I put up around us was doing a good job of halting them in their tracks. Sure, there was some interference with some distant blackstone structure woven through the walls, but not enough to stop me from putting up a near-impregnable dome of psychic energy just a few meters in diameter. So, how are you going to pry this thing open? Celine asked, looking up at the monolithic gate standing before us, still shimmering slightly from the force field protecting the meters-thick slab of solid necrodermis. I held a T-shot behind me, putting it in the path of an annoying beam of green energy that phased through my barrier. Spaced warped around the tip of my staff, deflecting the beam that would have torn Celine's neural system to shreds had it hit, or maybe it wouldn't have, but I didn't want to test it. The drawbridge I'd thrown into its path once dropped dead like a puppet with its strings cut. Those synaptic disintegrators were annoying, but not insurmountable or impossible to defend against. I just had to learn their quirks, and then I could tune my barrier to stop them from just phasing through it like it wasn't even there. How many of those things are still out there? Celine asked, looking over her shoulder with a frown and trying to track where the shot came from. Alas, the Deathmarks had learned to adapt and only stuck the tips of their weapons barrels out of their pocket space for just long enough to fire before closing the portal. Again, super annoying, but not something I couldn't deal with. I was still trying to track down the dimension, be that an external dimension, or a spatial dimension beyond the standard 3, they were using to hide in. It was a work in progress. We could just jump through that thing, I said, hooking a thumb over my shoulder to point at the still very much active Eternity Gate closing off the sole other exit of the room. They couldn't have made the trap more obvious even if they put up a sign, Celine said wryly, rolling her eyes. So? I'm thinking, I said. I can feel that the material behind the force field is resistant to psychic power. They probably built this thing to stop an elite Eldari kill team from going through it, and not these pale echoes that exist today, but War in Heaven Eldari. You could use the sword, Celine suggested helpfully, and I turned to give her an unimpressed look. Of course, it only made her carefully carved neutral expression shift into a guileless, innocent smile. It worked on the tomb ship, didn't it? It did, I grumbled, crossing my arms. So? Celine said, still maintaining her innocent mien. I had to suppress the sudden urge to spank the brattiness out of her, because she knew exactly what she was doing. I could practically feel the amusement radiate off of her in waves. Stab the door. What's your issue with the sword anyway? It's borrowed power, I said, pursing my lips. It draws on Eldari history and their own civilization's psychic weight. Feels like a crutch, or a power that I haven't made my own yet. It annoys me. It's also brutish, I'm sure I can figure out a way to work around this. Teleportation was iffy, considering whatever diverted me on our journey here could just as easily yank me around again if I tried to blink through this bulkhead. There is nothing shameful about being a brute, Celine hummed, helpfully draping herself across my shoulders. Then she spun us around and sent off a concentrated blast of telekinesis behind us, grinning down at me as I ended up in her arms. Huh. Got one of the fuckers. Sure enough, the shattered remains of a Deathmark's head were scattered across the wall far back, having been obliterated the moment it poked its head through the portal by that telekinetic blast. So your reasons for being aggravating were purely strategic? I asked with a quirked eyebrow, in no hurry to extract myself from her arms. Yep, Celine said smugly, then placed a gentle kiss on the tip of my nose, making me giggle despite our circumstances. "You're adorable when you're annoyed. I love the way your nose scrunches up, and your cheeks puff out." I just huffed, seeing no reason to fight down my body's natural inclination to blush. She's earned the right to see it if she could make me blush. Not that it was especially hard when she used that voice. "Are you going to play Pillow Princess all day, or are we going to get through this door before all the Necrons watching us die of boredom?" Celine asked amusedly, all the while hauling me back onto my feet. "Fine," I said, rolling my eyes as I held out a hand, having the witchblade that had been floating behind me slam its hilt into my waiting palm. "I'm going to stab the problem until it stops being a problem. Happy now?" Inordinately, Celine said, that mischievous vulpine smirk still tugging at the edge of her lips. The sword slashed out, the oversized claymore that looked almost comically large in my hands, tearing through the green force field and then carving a deep ravine into the metallic mass underneath. There was no resistance, there never was when I used this stupid thing. Still, the bulkhead was thick, and a sword wasn't exactly the best tool to use to carve my way through a solid mass of metal. I should have made a Nemesis Force pickaxe. I swung the sword again and again and again, slowly shutting away chunks of supremely dense metal that fell to the ground with heavy thuds the moment I stopped holding them in my telekinetic grasp. Each torso-sized chunk must have weighed more than 100 kilos. Inch by inch, I carved a tunnel through it and tore through even the fractal lattice of inch-thick blackstone woven into the material. Everything had a threshold, even blackstone was no absolute nullifier, and my witchblade channeling my soul's total psychic might eclipse this lattice's threshold and not by a narrow margin. Oddish swung out once or twice, swatting away errant beams lunging out from synaptic disintegrators while Celine played whack-a-mole with the skulking deathmarks behind me. With her focus being on them, the snipers had no chance of hitting her. She was just too fast, and once I showed her how, she quickly picked up on the trick to shed off the deathmark's namesake trick with a quick burst of psychic power. With a final swing, I broke through, and instead of struggling to widen the thin gap where air and light slipped through, I just set my feet and shouldered myself through what remained of the bulkhead. I burst out to the other side in a shower of dust and falling necrodermis, my ears catching the sound of a dozen electric thrums. My eyes snapped up, and I grinned, meeting the dozens of artillery-grade weaponry currently aimed at me and preparing to fire. I saw 4 lich guards standing at the front, one arm behind their backs while the other held war scythes and two-handed hyperphase blades aloft, their intelligent burning green eyes staring at me in open disdain. Behind them stood lines of locust destroyers, headed by a destroyer lord and 2 locust heavy destroyers, all of whom practically vibrated with barely contained rage and killing intent as their hateful gazes landed on me. My gaze darted around, noting the 4 doomsday arcs already glowing like 4 tiny suns, ready to unleash hell. Then, to the singular massive Gauss annihilator protruding from the ceiling, the car-sized crystal nestled inside the crescent-shaped focusing array already crackling with power. Those 5 weapons had enough firepower to punch through both the void shields and armored plating of Imperial Titans by themselves. I was looking at an arrangement of artillery pieces capable of taking down 5 Titans in seconds. Then there were the destroyers and the lich guards, who could go toe-to-toe with Imperial champions, unless they took their helms off, or even worse, were named in the official lore. There were also other things I didn't recognize, a pair of weird weapons mounted on every monolithic pillar and a few moving artillery pieces that were a bit too exotic to be recognizable on sight. All this happened in an instant, not a full millisecond having passed since I burst through the bulkhead. Celine appeared next to me at a similar speed, looking deathly serious as she gripped her bones word and reinforced her psychic shielding, running her own soul energy through the storm ward embedded into her power armor's chest. My own barriers snapped into place, a tiche ramming itself into the floor in front of me to reinforce them even further, and just in time too, as the doomsday cannons fired as one. 4 miniature suns bloomed into existence and spat beams of supercondensed plasma so hot it put the surface of a star to shame, and so fast I would have had to push myself a little to dodge it. But it was just plasma, and while my dome-shaped barrier shuddered as plasma washed over it and cascaded away in thick streams, it held without much trouble. It was only through my aura that I felt those strange devices on the pillars power up before gravity slammed into me. The metal floor cracked as my feet dug into it, the weight of a mountain suddenly pressing down on my shoulders, and I wasn't speaking figuratively. Celine slammed into the floor next to me, plastered out across the floor and unable to move an inch as the immense gravity started crushing her organs. My knees wobbled as I gritted my teeth and tapped a tiche, sending a surge of power through it to hopefully counteract this trick. It would have been simple. I felt like I was sitting at the bottom of a gravity well as I spread my senses and teased out the shape of spacetime's fabric around me. All I needed to do was counteract it. I'd done it before, it wasn't too hard. I just needed a bit of focus. Something which wasn't allowed to me as a monstrous insectoid creature made of gleaming metal materialized behind me. I gasped as I felt two of its sharp scythe-like talons embedded in my body, one through my head and the other through my heart. Stupid phase technology. It was hardly enough to put me down for good, but the surprise of feeling a pair of blades just appear inside my body made me freeze for just a moment, and that moment was just long enough for the Canoptech Ray's side to glow and unleash a strange beam of light that went right through my wards. Between one instant and the next, my surroundings changed. There was no transition period, nothing, just an infinite darkness and nothingness as far as I could perceive in all directions. It was cold, the temperature was hovering near absolute zero, and there was not a single blink of light anywhere. Just darkness. Infinite and all-consuming. I couldn't even perceive the veil of reality, or even the fabric of spacetime. There was nothing. This dimension was empty, so much so that not even physics, matter, space, or time existed in any solid way. For a brief instant, a tsunami of raw, primal dread ran through my body even as my internal healed in an instant. Celine wasn't here. I'd left her behind, and without my barriers, she was left crushed into the floor and exposed to the wrath of 4 doomsday cannons and much worse besides if she somehow survived those. My realm felt distant, the thread linking me to my soul having grown thin and fragile, as if a strong wind could make it snap. Still, it was still there, and that was all that mattered, because it allowed me to spread my awareness through my realm. I breathed a sigh of relief when I found Celine's soul still glowing radiantly, held safely within the cocoon my soul made for her. Both her soul and mind seemed hale and healthy, so nothing too horrible could have happened. With a flex of my will, a tenuous telepathic link snapped into place. Celine, are you okay? If you can call appearing in some creepy Necron's lab, tied up like it's bondage night while he tries to dissect me while I'm still alive okay, then yeah. I'm perfectly okay. I breathed a sigh of relief, ignoring her words for now. Even she wouldn't be this snarky if there was a real problem, even if I knew snark was one of her coping mechanisms for stress, something that had stuck with her since her days in the Imperial Guard. Tries? I asked back, managing to sound much less panicked this time around. With increasing success, Celine said, and there was a tinge of pain in her voice, and her words came out like she was gritting her teeth despite that being impossible in telepathic communication. Help, please, quickly. Something ugly and dark roiled in my heart as I heard the hint of panic seep into her voice, mixing with the pain she was unable to fully keep from slipping through the link along with her words. I'll be there in a second. I promised, an eerie calmness overtaking me as I took a deep breath. There was no air to breathe, but my eldritch powers converted bioenergy into faux air, nonetheless. My hand opened, and a tiche slammed into it in an instant, uncaring for the dimensions separating us. When I called, my trusty staff would always be there. 312, hasty retreat. My relative time slowed to a sudden and immediate crawl, and I plunged into the immense library of data held within my own mind. A human brain could hold incredible amounts of data, and my mind was far from human. I had long used my mind cores and various reconstruction models to dig up all my memories from my past life and build them from the ground up with perfect clarity. The human mind remembered only generalities, some strange bits and pieces that were imprinted deeper upon the psyche. I used those tidbits to remake everything. I rebuilt the entire Warhammer wiki, all the official Black Library books I've read, and hundreds of hours of lore videos I've watched over my life. My brain might not have remembered them, not in perfect detail, but what did that matter? My brain was hardly the same one I'd had in my past life, which meant my soul was the one that remembered. The soul did not forget. The human mind was fragile and forgetful, but the soul was not, and so I willed those memories back into existence and refined them until they sat in my mind with the same absolute clarity as the memories I've made since my rebirth in this galaxy. It took me a nanosecond to find a prime suspect for my current location, the Ghost Wind. A Necron subdimension primarily used by the Flayed Ones to travel across the galaxy at faster-than-light speeds. It was empty, a dark void untouched by matter, physics, and reality itself. Only Necron supertech could let you leave this place, and even with that, it was a lengthy, complicated affair. Besides them, there were also the Flayed Ones, but the less I so much as thought about them, the better. Next, I identified the cause of my being here, the Canoptech wraith that phased its blades into my body, ignoring all of my physical and psychic protections by sheer force of bullshit sci-fi super technology. One of the optional weapons that players could mount on a Canoptech wraith in the tabletop game was a transdimensional beamer, a Necron weapon originally designed as a convenient method of banishing unwanted debris, machinery, and failed experiments from tomb worlds and battlefields into a pocket dimension outside of the normal spacetime continuum. However, a transdimensional beamer could be used just as easily to exile and banish foes to a long and horrifying death from starvation in the same extra-dimensional space. The fucker had used that to dump me in the subspatial dimension where the horrors that haunted the Necron's nightmares dwelled. Alternatively, whatever Cryptech was currently in the process of cutting up my Celine had likely used that very same weapon to transport her to its lab. She'd been immobile, crushed into the floor by those weird gravitational weapons. Gravity pulses, my mind cores pinged helpfully, identifying the weapon based on what I'd seen and experienced, pulling up its wiki page in my mind. They were anti-air weapons designed to bring aircraft down. Considering the swiftness with which Celine had been displaced, they must have used a transdimensional beamer on her as well, just aiming it at another subspatial dimension. But one that had a Cryptech slab in it, so a Cryptech dimensional sanctum, most likely. Transdimensional beamers were transliminal weapons, they weren't teleporters, so she had to be in a subdimension or pocket space. Troublesome, but not a problem without many possible solutions. Worst case scenario, I yanked her soul free of her body and made her a new one. With her soul being held in my realm, I could do that with a flex of my will. But still. Maybe it was my need for vengeance burning bright and hot as the core of a star, or just sentimentality not wanting to leave Celine's soulless corpse in the hands of a creepy Cryptech, but I wanted to give a try to rescuing her first, body and soul both. What was all this power I had at my disposal good for if I was still forced to be satisfied with solutions that were merely good enough? Saving Celine within the next second or two was the bare fucking minimum, but I wouldn't be satisfied until I had the remains of that accursed Cryptech that tried to take her from me crushed into a heap of scrap. To do that, I needed to force my way into his supposedly secure Cryptech dimensional sanctum. The Necrons were the masters of material technology, and as such were more than capable of creating their own personalized pocket dimensions and subspaces for exclusive use. While not part of the warp, these pocket dimensions lie outside of real space and were connected to tomb worlds via reality tethers. They could have strongholds built within them, and the dimensions could be designed so that only their owners or serving minions could enter or exit them. So, usually, my only option would have been to attempt to latch onto the undoubtedly well-concealed reality tether connecting the subspace to the hollow sun. Considering Necrons had been fighting a race of super psychers for millennia and won, I doubted it would be particularly easy or quick to do. I didn't know how I measured up to an old one in pure psychic might, but I was sure they had me beat in skill and expertise by an immensely wide margin. They'd made the webway, created the Eldari, the Quarks, and the warp gates that connected the two ends of the galaxy together. Fortunately for me, and unfortunately for the Cryptech I was about to meet, I could cheat. I didn't need to follow the reality tether when I had a much more substantial link to Celine, who happened to be inside that subspace. I'd have worried about that strange anti-teleportation countermeasure acting up again and getting in my way, but I was like 70% sure it wouldn't be able to reach me. I was in the Ghost Wind, already outside the normal spacetime continuum, and I was traveling to another pocket space likewise disconnected from what I myself called real space. Essentially, the Necrons posted speed cams all the way across the highway, but I was taking the smaller country roads. Or rather, I was about to launch myself from a cannon on one island to another, instead of taking the bridge full of cops. Yeah, that was a much better metaphor. There were no roads to take between pocket dimensions, just sheer non-existence and the warp. The primary and greatest problem was the lack of space as a concept. It wasn't merely fluctuating and unstable, it straight up didn't exist between the two pocket dimensions, which meant it wouldn't even be enough to figure out where it was. I had to follow that thread and yank myself across. I hummed under my breath, my vocal cords shifting to perfectly replicate the haunting tunes of the Crotalid's song. Inside my realm, my soul vibrated, echoing the same song. In a blink, my avatar slipped through the fabric of this lesser dimension and dipped below it, submerging itself into the ever-present immaterium. The moment it emerged inside my realm, my soul latched onto Celine's soul tether and practically booted my avatar through it, momentarily willing that thread to become a spatial tunnel. How many laws of physics and reality I just broke with that one single action, I couldn't tell. Not that it mattered. My soul far eclipsed the sheer psychic might my avatar was able to bring to bear, and I could make use of that might for this little trick, if only to an extent. A tear in space spat me out, and I centered myself in an instant, my senses unfurling like a tidal wave as I surveyed my new surroundings. I was once more far from my realm and firmly outside the bounds of real space as well. Though this pocket dimension felt lesser in a way. The ghost wind had been a true dimension, infinite and eternal. It wasn't made, it just was a part of existence. The pocket space I'd found myself in was different. Limited, small, and clearly artificial. I could feel the absolute nothingness surrounding this single fortress, barely larger than a medieval castle back home. My gaze snapped to Celine, my beautiful, ferocious little minx, who was held up in thin air, her limbs stretched like a starfish by bands of eerie green energy. The cryptek wasn't one for half measures, that was for sure, because that thing looked exactly like the apparatus Trazyn had put me in, proudly proclaiming it to be able to imprison even a star god. For good measure, there was also a collection of black stone pylons arranged around the room in an intricate array I was unfamiliar with, but was probably responsible for the fact that Celine hadn't crushed the cryptek into a pancake of scrap metal despite the metallic twat trying to peel off her armor with what looked like a hyperphase scalpel. I flexed my will, and a telekinetic backhand swatted the cryptek into the wall 50 meters away with a sound akin to a thundercrack echoing in the cavernous laboratory. In an instant, I was standing in his place before Celine, a hand raised and teasing out the boundary of the strange force field surrounding her and what must have been a tesseract labyrinth in its half-open state. He must have altered the settings to allow himself to move unimpeded through the force field. Furthermore, he must have made it so that it still kept Celine's psychic power bound or unreachable. Did this thing have a whitelist-type function? It must have been a modified tesseract labyrinth built for this exact purpose. The bound Eldari I could see, some in the characteristic robes of warlocks, also supported that theory. The entire lab was full of bound prisoners, or rather, test subjects. Some were still alive, if barely, but most were corpses held in stasis. I pushed, the force field reeled against me with a surprising amount of resistance, my hand barely moving. It didn't matter. A tish shimmered into existence in my grasp, and I pushed it forward, psychic energy surging into the staff, condensing and intensifying, then fueling the reality warping effect shrouding its tip. I willed the force field to split, to open up a door for me to step through, and my trusty stave forced it to obey. That was the problem with technology like this. They still had to obey the laws of physics in some form or work through manipulating and bending those laws. But with sufficient psychic power, I could just tell physics to kindly sod off and fuck itself. Which is exactly what I did there, gently pouring energy through the force field and using it to conjure a film of energy between Celine's skin and the tesseract's effects, trying to stifle her attempts to free herself. Those effects went deep, pervading every cell of her body and rejecting all her attempts to summon her psychic energies or soul energy from my realm. I cut that off, separating her from the effect even if she remained momentarily bound. Once that was done, I could feel her body surge with power, and I took that as my cue to take the next step. The film of energy hardened, becoming an inviolable barrier as a massive force tore into the tesseract around her. Like most prisons, it was much more vulnerable against someone trying to break in from the outside than to its prisoners trying to break out. It held for a moment, then another and another as I felt a cascade of alarms and warnings blare all across the laboratory as some sort of energy source deep beneath my feet roared to life, funneling an immense amount of energy to reinforce the Tesseract's grip. I wasn't using most of my power, not yet. Brute forcing it would end up with Celine's pulped remains covering me in a shower of gore, even if I did manage to tear her free of the Tesseract's grip. The problem was, if that reinforcing energy reached the damned thing, I'd get locked into a tug of war over Celine's body, which wouldn't be any more enjoyable for her than ending up as a pulverized mist of blood and gore. "This is going to hurt," I said, then pulled just before the Tesseract could lock up. Right. Emergency shutdown. It was trying to engage its full lockdown procedures, which would include locking the prisoner in a stasis field and then shoving them into a pocket space inside the fist-sized Tesseract. I was as gentle as I could manage without sacrificing speed, and Celine just gritted her teeth, radiating acceptance and acknowledgement as her own soul energy infused her body, quickly joined by the bioenergy in her armor that I had made to reinforce her physical form. The machine screamed, energy of a kind I couldn't name writhing out of control as I tore Celine through the gap and out of the Tesseract's grasp. Her limbs were bent the wrong way, and half her internal organs were little more than mulch, the other half having been turned to dust when a snapping tendril of energy atomized the side of her torso. She landed in my arms with a gasp, and just in time too, as the towering machinery that used to be the Tesseract labyrinth slammed together into an ever-shifting cube the size of my fist, floating idly in front of me, arcs of green energy crackling wildly around it. My barrier slammed into place, warding off the seeking tendrils of green energy and the violent discharge from the Tesseract as it slammed shut. It washed over the dome of psychic power, finding no purchase while I focused on flooding Celine's broken body with bioenergy. From her perspective, it all happened so fast that she wouldn't even have had time to register the pain of it all before she was once more fully hale and healthy, had I not improved her reaction time and nervous system. As it was, the roughly 30 milliseconds she spent torn apart might as well have been full seconds from her perspective. Half a minute of indescribable pain that would have sent a lesser person into shock. I hugged her close, a shudder running through me as sympathetic ripples of agony spread through my own body. Sometimes, having a telepathic bond was beautiful, other times, you got to feel the agony your partner went through in excruciating detail. "That hurt," Celine mumbled, sounding relieved, but her voice was still a bit hoarse. "I'm fine, you can let me go now." "Where is that metallic fucker anyway?" "You're fine?" I asked, pulling back a bit and looking her over with all my senses again. "I went through worse," Celine said wryly, rolling her eyes before peering over my shoulder to pan her gaze across the lab. "Right, she's not some fragile 21st century wallflower who never experienced worse pain than her period cramps." "Well, it looks like he did a runner. I guess we should make ourselves scarce as well." "Where are we anyway?" "A pocket dimension," I said, grunting in annoyance as I swept my senses across the pocket space. Yep, the Necron I had backhanded into the wall was gone, having somehow survived the impact and remained intact enough to teleport himself out of here. Wonderful. A cryptech dimensional sanctum, if I had to guess. Right on time, gateways opened up all across the walls and swallowed up the test subjects along with rows of strange machinery that were scattered around the lab. But those were not protected by anything nearly as annoying as a Tesseract labyrinth, and with the cryptech gone, I was feeling a bit petty. With but a thought, telekinetic forces tore into the machines and yanked the bound, caged, and stasis-locked lab rats free of their bonds. If nothing else, I could count this as my good deed of the week. None of them was conscious, doped up on some Necron anesthetic or other type of drug that kept them from doing anything other than groaning as I hauled them up into a pile. "Okay, leaving now," I hummed under my breath, but instead of repeating a reverse of my previous trick, I found the reality tether anchoring this pocket dimension to the hollow sun. From this side, it was easy to find, even its subtle energies appearing bright and blatantly obvious against the backdrop of sheer nothingness that otherwise surrounded the pocket space. Space split into a gaping rift before me, and I felt some alien force trying to co-opt it, but failed when I tied the portal's spatial tunnel to the reality tether, forcing it to stay on target. When it failed to overwhelm my control, it switched gears and tried to tear the spatial working apart, which was much harder to resist, given how finicky spatial manipulations could be. A slight destabilization of the fabric of space inside the tunnel could cause fragile little humans to fall apart. A tish thrummed in my grasp, almost purring like a pleased predatory cat as I fed it more of my essence as fuel to counteract the alien force. I stepped through in a hurry, Celine still held in a one-handed princess carry, and I dragged my rescued pile of lab rats behind myself, letting the rift slam shut the moment the last of them floated through. Just in time, too, as I'd felt an absolutely massive energy build up in the lab right before a gigantic turret dropped out of the ceiling and took us within its sights. In just a few more moments or a second at most, it would have fire, and that weapon made my danger sense tingle in a way not even the particle whips could manage. Worse, I knew too little to accurately identify just what that weapon might have been. We emerged right beside a titanic green crystal in the shape of an upside-down obelisk, hovering a few meters off the floor. Pulses of energy thrummed through it, making the fabric of space quiver and fold neatly around it into strange, fractal shapes. The process repeated endlessly, folding and unfolding, back and forth. I shook my head, averted my gaze from the strangely hypnotic sight, and took a firmer look at our surroundings. Based on the curvature of spacetime, I could feel underpinning the star system I found myself in. I quickly confirmed that we were back on the hollow sun and without much time having passed in the interim. That was good. Warhammer 40k was infamous for temporal inconsistencies and time travel shenanigans, and yeeting yourself outside the bounds of regular spacetime was a good way to end up as an unintentional time traveler. Though regular warp travel was still the most surefire way to cast yourself adrift upon the river of time. The thing that was a constant about warp travel was that it was reliably unreliable. I also didn't sense anything or anyone nearby. No Necrons or Canoptech constructs as far as I could sense, just rooms upon rooms filled with alien, cold machinery slowly whirling, clanking and thrumming. Well, I think a temporary retreat might be in order, I mused aloud. I'd thought we'd be fine if we were careful, but I was still underestimating the Necrons, plus I had a bunch of drugged out of their minds ex-lab rats on my hands, too, who I had to do something with, or they were all going to get atomized in the first firefight we got into. Hell, without Celine's soul thread to follow out of the ghost wind, then the reality tether to ride back into real space on, I would have had to either just wing the teleportation back into the main spacetime continuum, or I'd have had to abandon the fight by using Valinith's soul thread as a guide back into the materium, which would have ended up with me back on Valia, months of regular FTL flight away from the hollow sun. So not optimal, to say the least. Preferably, I would have an anchor, a retreat point nearby. Hopefully, Celine was spooked enough about nearly getting dissected to not be too pouty about my plans to dump her on a nearby planet and continue on my rampage through the hollow sun by my lonesome. I certainly was spooked by it, but she was an Imperial born and raised, and a rogue trader at that, so she was quite a bit more mentally resilient than my 21st century Earth common sense would suggest any regular woman could be. I wouldn't be surprised if she'd bounced back from the experience in a few hours, if not less. 313, Round 2. Trying to prevent another teleportation mishap, I attempted to repeat the trick I'd used to get inside the dimensional sanctum, and it worked surprisingly well. The rift tore open before me, the spatial tunnel curling around the soul thread leading far away from here towards Valinith on distant Valia. Again, I felt the hollow sun's automatic countermeasures attempt to mess with it, but having that guiding thread and, more importantly, knowing to expect the interference in advance made all the difference. I jumped through again, a worryingly subdued Celine still clinging to me as I did, with my pile of freed lab rats floating behind me. At the exact moment we traveled beyond the hollow sun's reach, and I felt its anti-teleportation countermeasures lose their grip on the spatial tunnel, I altered the destination. Instead of following the soul thread halfway across the Jericho Reach, I routed it back into real space. As expected, we were thrown into deep interstellar space, but with a quick survey of the fabric of spacetime, I managed to narrow down our current location. I had memorized the properties of all the stars in the Reach, and once I was close enough to them, I also added the more accurate feel of their gravity wells. Knowing that, it wasn't hard to place myself on the map once I reached out to the nearest stellar body with my gravitational senses and matched its properties to my memorized list of stars. I'm going to drop you off somewhere safe. I'm sorry, but it seems like this excursion turned out to be more dangerous than I'd thought. I messaged Celine telepathically, mentally lining up my reasons and plotting out an argument to convince her to accept it. Preferably, without being sulky about it. Yeah, Celine replied, gently resting her head on my shoulder as we floated there in deep space, my psychic power maintaining a bubble of breathable air so we could be reasonably comfortable and so my pile of prisoners wouldn't die. I knew Necrons were dangerous, but I suppose they were giving minimum effort in the battles I've read reports about. Sorry, I got in the way. Hey, it's fine, I said, squeezing her reassuringly, which put a soft smile on her face that made my heart stutter. They caught me off guard as well. I didn't think that Wraith would be able to so easily bypass my defenses. Hyperphase technology was so fucking busted. I could face tank a slash from a Grey Knight wielding Nemesis Force weapons or the Swarmlord trying to dice me up. But that stupid blade went right through me. I needed to upgrade my wards and defenses again, though I'd need to grab a few hyperphase weapons to experiment with for that. What happened to you? Celine asked curiously. A Canoptech Wraith popped into existence behind me, 2 of its blades already phased into me so they were lodged in my spine and skull. It was a bit distracting, I said with a grimace. That had been stupid. I should have been able to react fast enough to blast the Wraith away, or at least to throw up some chaff before its beam struck. Hell, I could have cut my body in half and transferred my consciousness into my cut-off feet to avoid getting thrown into the ghost wind like a bag of garbage. There were downsides to maintaining my pain receptors and keeping my consciousness primarily in my avatar instead of tugging it around like a puppet. Then I got hit by the same beam you did, except it threw me into a dark void instead of a lab. Oh, Celine said, switching back to boring old vocal communication. What was that thing he had me locked up in anyway? I couldn't. My body and my psyker energy just refused to obey me. A tesseract labyrinth, if I had to guess, I said, shrugging lightly. Don't feel too bad about it. Those things can perfectly imprison greater demons and even transcendent tan shards. Even I couldn't escape it when Trazyn fully locked my previous avatar in one of them. Necrons are pretty bullshit when they put their minds to it. Huh, Celine mumbled. Well, I suppose I learned that trying to take on a Necron crown world alone is still beyond my capabilities. That's good. You're fine, that's all that matters, I said, subconsciously tightening my hold on her body. She was tougher than a regular custodian, and yet she still felt oh so fragile and small when I held her. Celine frowned for a moment, and I could easily decipher that she didn't feel all too happy about feeling, well, vulnerable. Weak. Or like she was my weakness. Then her shoulders slumped with a small sigh, just closing her eyes as she leaned up and placed a gentle kiss on my cheek. Thank you, she said softly. Stay like this for another minute, then you can drop me off somewhere while you go tear a new asshole to the Necrons. Just be careful. I doubt we saw every trick they have up their sleeves. I will be, I promised sincerely, smiling as we just floated there and watched the stars, enjoying each other's warmth and closeness. I arrived back in the system the hollow sun was located in nearly an hour later. Cuddling with a sad Celine until she was back to her usual spirits was more important, bite me. I'd have stayed longer, but she'd metaphorically kicked me out of the small base I'd thrown together for her in a neighboring system, telling me she was not some fragile wallflower in need of pampering. I only left once she managed to say that without it sounding like a lie. She'd be fine for a few hours. The small base, attached to the side of a dwarf planet, had artificial gravity and breathable air, along with a small but furnished room. I left some novels and books I'd managed to reconstruct from my previous life for her, but she said she'd just meditate, so maybe they'd see no use. Either way, I had a task at hand. It was time for round 2 of my Hollow Sun run. The Necrons would find out just how annoying it could be to fight a foe who refused to die and could respawn nearby no matter what they did. As far as I was concerned, I was willing to treat this entire conquest as a roguelike game and tease out the best way to take the crown world down, even if it took me dozens of tries. I'd have to always start from near the same spot, too, considering that I had no guiding light to follow this time around, so I had little hope in entirely avoiding the anti-teleportation countermeasures. They'd drag me to the prepared kill zone again, but I'd be ready, and I would be fighting dirty. Alright, first go the chaff and the distraction. Without much thought, I created half-assed clones of myself. They looked the same as me when fully armored up, and they even had the capabilities of a standard combat drone. One after the other, I threw them at different sections of the hollow sun with quick teleports. I could just barely catch the Crownworld's strange pull latch onto the teleportation right at the tail end of it, well after I'd let go of it. I sensed their deaths come in quick bursts in the following moments, sending little signals into the warp that I was on the lookout for. That little trick was a byproduct of my attempt to create artificial souls to saturate my pariah clones with. In the end, it was only good for this, glowing like a tiny star in the warp when the soulless drone I anchored the glob of soul energy onto was slain. I counted them, and it took 1 second for 80% of my drones to die, with 3/4 of what remained lived for another second, and the last few persisted for a whole 3 seconds. That wasn't promising. What the hell did the Necrons stick into that prepared kill zone? I mean, sure, those drones weren't anything to write home about, but they could have easily taken an Astartes if 2 of them ganged up on a Marine. The cost in bioenergy was negligible, not even a minor rounding error, so I kept throwing in drones, though this time I tried to maintain control over the teleportation and reel against the pull that latched onto them at the end. There was no noticeable difference for the first 20, but by the time I reached the 30th drone, they were taking nearly 10 seconds to die. Which, I assumed, meant I'd managed to throw them into some secondary peripheral zone with fewer weapons. I tried to send the next batch of 20 drones all at once, scattering them at the last moment, but I fucked it up somehow, because they all died the moment they landed. I wasn't splitting my focus and willpower properly. I tried again, then again and again. The cost was still miles away from being even a rounding error, so I didn't feel any reservation about throwing 100 drones into the grinder, then another 100, because I was starting to get better at it. My timing improved, narrowing down to the fraction of a nanosecond it needed to be for maximum efficiency. By the 220th dead clone, my drones were surviving for minutes. By the 250th, none of them was dying on landing, which I took to mean that I had finally managed to scatter them all, or that I was finally not teleporting them into walls, or into separate chunks. Could be either way. I sent in 3 more batches of 10 clones. In the 4th batch, one of the clones was replaced by me. At the very last moment, timed as perfectly as I could manage, I scattered the 10 of us, throwing myself and 2 clones even further than ever before. It wasn't that much, just a few 100 meters, but based on my calculations and assessment, it should have thrown me beyond the second wall surrounding the kill zone. The last time, the Canoptech Wraith had ambushed me when passing through the same wall, cutting my way through the bulkhead that was likely the only path through. I reached out to every drone still within range of my somewhat suppressed telepathy and activated the implanted bioenergy inside them, causing the 5 nearest ones to start multiplying. In 5 seconds flat, those 5 drones became 50 as the tiny beads of eldritch flesh inside them exhausted their tiny stores of bioenergy. Then I let them loose, acting like I was none of them, creating 49 drones of my own before handing over control of my body to a replica of the algorithm driving those drones, though I kept carefully nudging them all in the direction I wanted. They spread out, mapped the rooms, the hallways, the tunnels, looking for the path leading out of here and into the greater hollow Sunday. Sooner or later, I'd find it, and I'd fight dirty this time. No one did wars of attrition quite like I did, and from what I knew, that kind of battle would place the regent of the Subakar dynasty in the toughest spot out of all my options. The drones outside my telepathic reach started dropping one after the other over the course of the following handful of minutes, but it was only when one I did have a link to fell that I finally saw just what kind of enemy I'd have to face here. A massive insectoid war machine shaped like a centipede that could eat jeeps for breakfast, made of living metal. It burst through the floor and, in moments, ripped the drone apart with scythe-like limbs. But that wasn't the problem, nor was the fact that the creature left behind no obvious borehole once it burst out of the ground. No, the problem was that my telepathic link started wavering even before the thing showed itself. Once it appeared, I had to pour energy and willpower into the link to keep it alive, and even then, it felt like trying to protect a tiny burning matchstick in a raging storm. That was a Canoptech Tombstalker, if I wasn't mistaken, and like spiders, they could be equipped with gloom prisms, which could generate energy fields which created zones that were shrouded and shielded from warp-spawned powers, such as that of psychers. Unfortunately, my powers were included in this, unlike the Tyrannid shadow in the warp. After all, the energy field worked on the real space end of things, not by filling the nearby warp with shadowy darkness. Wonderful, but at least it can't go fully out of phase like a wraith to go invisible. I mused, which was true. The thing could only move through inert matter, and it also couldn't go effectively invisible like wraiths. On the other hand, some more advanced versions of them, Canoptech tomb sentinels, could be equipped with exile cannons, which were the less effective little brothers of the transdimensional beamer that sent me on a non-negotiable vacation to the ghost wind, so I'd have to be careful if I saw any of them wearing a massive cannon in place of an insectoid head. But the simple tombstalkers wouldn't be a problem, not even to my drones now that I knew what to expect when my telepathic link started wavering. Although they would be annoying to face in the narrower corridors. They were large enough to treat tanks like chew toys, after all. Another drone in the opposite direction came upon a patrolling squad of 3 locust destroyers, which set upon it with the murderous fervor destroyer cults were known for, though even their nasty 4-barreled Gauss cannons couldn't quite deal with the drone in a wide open space the size of a football stadium when it started bouncing around like a demented pinball. It was so nice of the Necrons that their architecture favored cavernous halls so large you could barely see the ceiling, because that was the environment my swift and agile drones thrived in, especially when facing foes that they had to dodge the weapons of. 2 more locust destroyer squads floated in, rushing towards other drones on their strange hoverpads. Then a group of 3 Canoptech spiders, accompanied by twice as many wraiths shifting in and out of phase, came within range of my aura. More and more small groups of Necrons just kept on appearing in my range, one after the other. I felt my more distant drones start dying one by one as well, until only the ones I was mentally nudging this way and that myself remained alive. I'd keep up the charade, even if it was starting to fail, until I found the next bulkhead. Then I'd have to opt for stealth once I was out into the crown world proper. I wouldn't want either the Regent nor the Cryptek I came back to murder the shit out of to have cause to even consider escape. Eternity gates could connect to other tomb worlds, and if they were desperate enough to abandon their crown world, I might never find them. And that was unacceptable. 314, I am in your walls. Surprised face. My drones exploded into action, and I angled myself and the drones not yet engaged in combat to avoid the fighting. I needed to find the path forward, away through these massive walls of reinforced metal so thick I couldn't sense the other side of them at times. The hollow sun must have been massive, somewhat like Serenade, though instead of an artificial planet it was more like a spherical space station the size of a large planet that just so happened to be located inside the heart of a star. I avoided the wraiths and the tomb sentinels as much as possible, not wanting to be dumped in the ghost wind again so soon. I doubted they could catch me off guard again, but better safe than sorry. My drones spread out. The ones dancing around locust destroyer squads were leading the bloodthirsty Necrons around by the nose, and 2 of the floating horrors had already been destroyed. More and more approached, and I made another 100 decoy combat drones when I was reasonably sure that no one was watching me. They had to be closing in on me by then, so stealth would only go so far. Chaos would give me the opportunity to confuse and distract them, hopefully enough to give myself the time I needed. The next 20 minutes went by in an extremely high-paced game of cat and mouse. Dozens of my drones fell, but with me nudging them around to save them from making moronic decisions, they each took at least a handful of Necrons down before they fell. That number would have been much higher had the enemy been flooding me with Necron warriors, or even mortals, but they didn't. Destroyers, locust heavy destroyers, deathmarks, Canoptech constructs, and even the occasional Lich Guard were the ones hunting down my scattered mob of drones, not the chaff. My avatar managed to avoid any active engagements, but that was no longer possible. I found the bulkhead leading out of this level and up to the next. The map in my head looked like an onion, the kill zone I'd escaped at its very core with layers built up around it, and only one gate, as far as I was aware, leading from one layer to the next. The problem was, there was a fuck-off huge gathering of Necrons gathered in the titanic chamber that ended in a monolithic bulkhead. I saw the Locust Destroyer Lord flanked by 2 Lich Guards, and the legion of immortals gathered around the cavernous chamber, using the architecture to their advantage to set up a superb kill zone for anyone wanting to reach the bulkhead. Then there were, of course, the same weapons platforms as in the chamber I'd gone through previously, though in even greater numbers. 4 massive pyramids rivaling those at Giza sat in the chamber, looking comparatively tiny compared to the titanic open space of the hall, and each had large glowing green crystals floating above their tips. Necron monoliths, except these were much larger and immobile to boot. Canoptek spiders, stalkers, and sentinels scuttled around in the darkness, crawling along the walls and the monolithic buildings filling up the open space, and I was certain that there were dozens of wraiths and deathmarks as well waiting out of phase, ready to strike. On top of that, the other Necron forces scattered around, still hunting down my dispersed drones with more or less success, were also something to consider. They could collapse on my position from behind at any moment, and while they wouldn't be able to cut off my path to retreat, I liked having some breathing room. But even all of that put together wasn't giving me the same sense of danger as that strange cannon that tried to shoot me before I teleported out of the cryptech's dimensional sanctum. What the hell was that thing, even? The only thing I knew was that I could not get hit by it. Ever. I'd need chaos, confusion, and a lot of distraction. I'd let the enemy focus their fire on me in my previous run, but that was stupid. I had to divide their fire, especially because I couldn't allow myself to take some of their weapons, even with every protection I had. So I had my speed to dodge and a let's go with 500 fully operational combat drones as a distraction. Well, as much as they could be called a mere distraction despite being fully capable of defeating almost everything I could see. Only the Locust Destroyer Lord and the Lichguard would be trouble, aside from the weapon emplacements. Still, with 500 of them, I'd still bet on my drones coming out victorious. I just had to somehow make them in a way that didn't give away that I was the real me. I was sure I was being watched, after all. Well, all I had to do was make it impossible to tell which one of the drones I was, which I had 1 or 2 ideas on. I paused behind the last bend, keeping 10 drones near me while I sent the rest ahead, though I did poke them once. The expendable decoys exploded forth, their speed tripling as they burned their internal bioenergy to boost themselves. In half a minute, they'd turn to ash or at least desiccated corpses, but they just needed to take the deathmark's attention off of me for a blink. Ivory white eldritch flesh erupted from my body, throwing up a dome of organic mass in an instant, layers upon layers of psychoactive chitin settling upon one another before the first unliving green beam of energy struck it. A layer disintegrated, but slowly, over the span of long seconds during which it ate up a dozen more shots. Soul energy and bioenergy flowed through them, turning each layer as durable as Astartes' power armor. A synaptic disintegrator firing somewhere behind me made me perk up in curiosity, even as I stepped aside to dodge it in case it penetrated the dome. It didn't. My body wasn't connected to the dome through anything other than tendrils of eldritch flesh snaking through the air, and the cascading synaptic disintegration energy found no purchase on it even as it bypassed the energized chitin. Whether it was the potent bioenergy roaring through the tendrils or just its atypical nature, it stopped the attack from reaching my avatar. Good to know. I just needed to keep a thin layer of eldritch flesh under my own chitinous power armor to become immune to synaptic disintegrators. And then I got to work. 100 of my own Draugr, my most advanced and powerful combat drones, and then 300 more drones fashioned after a variety of tyrannid organisms. Lictors, termagants, hormigants, rippers, tyrannid warriors, carnifexes, hive tyrants, and of course at least 50 bioforms to serve as artillery just because. The last 100, for now, were a wide variety of stealth drones I cooked up, using different types and combinations of organic cloaking technology. If I wanted to go unnoticed, I needed to know what kind of stealth could fool the Necron's sensors. The 500 drones exploded into the titanic chamber, and the Necrons wasted absolutely no time laying into them. Wall-mounted Gauss cannons fired in tandem with the hundreds of immortals settled in their perches high up on balconies protruding from the walls. Down on the surface, the legion of Locust destroyers moved as one, the heavy destroyers and the destroyer lord leading the charge with all the fury of a machine that abhorred the very existence of organic life. For now, I waited and watched, taking active control of every drone and controlling them not unlike a pseudo-hive mind. Their implanted natural instincts and biocomputers running basic combat algorithms were the basis for saving me from having to micromanage everything, allowing me to focus on guiding them and arranging them into a cohesive swarm. My standard Draugr let the Tyranid copies rush on ahead and tank the lounging beams of entropic green energy. Numbers were the best counter to Necrons. Their Gauss flares were slow, and didn't kill instantly, not Tyranids at least. Even the Gaunts could take a handful of steps after being struck, even as their bodies disintegrated more and more with each step. The problem was with more powerful weapons, like the Gauss cannons of the Locust destroyers, or the even worse enigmatic exterminators or Gauss annihilators carried by the heavy destroyers. Those things were nasty, the first one unleashing a pulse that broke apart atomic bonds by making every single atom repel every other atom in the struck target. The result was a rather swift and explosive death. The other one was just a Gauss weapon taken to the extreme, but even that one vaporized targets in an instant. Not that it mattered when there were so few of them. Each enigmatic pulse came once every few seconds, exploded a handful of Tyranids, then powered down for a few seconds. The Annihilator was worse. The heavy destroyer swung its arm from left to right in the 1 second it was active, which tore through the ranks of my drones. At least that one was easier to dodge, being a slower beam weapon and all. Then the two sides crashed into each other, the destroyer lord not even slowing as it tore whatever came its way apart with its war scythe, even as bits and pieces of its metallic body were torn away in return for each kill. The main problem was with the Immortals. My current lineup had no hope to climb up the smooth walls of the chamber, or scuttle up the pillars to take out the Necrons taking potshots from up there. I made another 50 of every currently deployed drone type to replenish their rapidly diminishing numbers, then let loose 100 purest range Genestealers, because those were the best climbing Tyranids I knew, 50 flyers, a mix of gargoyles, harpies, and even a harridan. They tried to flank me, the Necrons I'd left behind in the preceding 20 minutes all converging on my position from tunnels leading to the intersection I'd plopped myself down in. I needed something to stand up to sustained Gauss fire, which couldn't be organic. I'm so stupid. I yanked every fallen Necron towards myself, grasping them with a bit of telekinesis as I altered my plans. While I was at it, I sent a few Immortals flying off their balconies and gathered their remains as well once they fell and shattered. Once I had the heaps of scrap near my little dome, I extended eldritch tendrils to gather them up. I couldn't absorb necrodermis or turn it into bioenergy, but I could shape it, mold it to my liking. So around my dome grew a new layer made of living metal, covering the organic structure and leaving only a single gate on one side free, leaving the surface of the chitinous dome uncovered in that small section. That will do for now. I sent out 100 more drones, of all types, to hold back the Necrons coming at my position from behind while I focused on analyzing the effectiveness of the different stealth drone designs. Meanwhile, I kept up a rough stalemate against the Necron forces in the chamber ahead, though I did reorient a few smaller groups to try to destroy the weapons platforms, with more or less success. I didn't want those monoliths to activate, nor the lightning arcs, Gauss flux arcs, or whatever else they had lying in wait. They remained dormant for now, for some reason, which could be both a good or a very bad thing. Time would tell. Deathmarks took potshots at my stealth drones, picking some of them off despite them being invisible and cloaked from most standard avenues of detection I knew. I noted every fallen drone, their design, how long they lasted and how on target the deathmarks were with their shots. The ones that got hit with the deathmark's namesake energy signature were written off as failures, their designs either dismissed or thrown back for improvement. Drones died, Necrons fell, the sounds of war echoed far in the cavernous architecture, and all the while I waited, I learned, and I got stabbed in the brain by a Canoptech wraith. Again. God damn it. I groaned, my fist already buried in the metallic serpent's body. My other hand lashed out, clawed fingers burrowing into the creature's metal skin, gripping it tightly. It twitched, the massive blade at the tip of its serpentine tail lashing out fast as lightning, aiming to bisect me at the waist even as I tore the worm's body in half. I swatted the tail and its blade aside with a tish, noting that the wraith failed to phase through it like it could bypass my chitinous armor. I yanked the scythe out of my skull, the wound mending instantly. Annoying, I thought my psychic barriers, combined with the energized chitin that was the equivalent of power armor, would have kept these damned things away. Alas, no such luck. My lips, however, did pull into a grin when a canoptek tombstalker, one of those massive worms, charged at my dome. It phased through the necrodermis layer around it, but the energized chitin stopped it cold in its tracks, leaving the stupid thing with a broken head and its body phased halfway into my dome. Sucks to suck. That stupid wraith had just passed right through my barriers, even when they were anchored to the storm ward. Was it the phase tech or the gloom prism? That latter one was supposed to disable psychic powers in a 50-meter radius, though I barely felt the effect on my barriers, so it was probably the wraith's advanced phase tech. I really needed a counter for that, but what? How? I shook my head and refocused, forming a dozen bioprocessors inside the dome to further anchor my consciousness here. I also threw up some decoys so the next wraith wouldn't know for sure which one to ambush, since there were 10 of me standing around. Meanwhile, my avatar melted into the eldritch tendrils snaking across the floor, and my soulbone skeleton, in turn, was embedded in the innermost layer of the chitinous dome. Alright. So far so good. Which is, of course, when the weapon emplacements in the chamber ahead started to simultaneously power on. Well, fuck. I guess they stopped playing around. Some of the stealth prototype designs are still alive and seemingly undetected. Okay, I can work with this. All that was left to do was break through the bulkhead and then fake my death. Then I could go see about hunting down the cryptek that had hurt Celine, and then the regent after him. Yeah, that sounded like as good a plan as any. 315, Ahatek, Redux. Oscan, Ahatek said, his synthetic voice cold and detached. He'd long gone beyond furious, his rage was apoplectic, but it was kept in check by a combination of immense self-control, befuddlement, and need. What am I looking at? Ahatek trailed off, his ocular sensors finally catching sight of his favored cryptek after the notification alerted him of the codifier's arrival on his command deck. It took a moment, which was practically an eternity to a necron of his caliber, but he analyzed Oscan. What happened to you? Ahatek questioned, staring at the scuffed cryptek, who walked with a limp, leaning on his staff with each step. All around his metallic body, the cryptek wore marks of recent battle, some wounds still in the process of mending themselves. The crest on his head was broken, the single ocular sensor blinking erratically while the arm not clutching his staff was little more than a mangled mess hanging loosely at his side. The eye invaders infiltrated my D-dimensional sanctum, Oscan said, his vocalizer fizzling and being taken over by static between each word. Had he still been in possession of facial muscles or a face, Ahatek would have probably grimaced at the grating noise and even more so at the state of his most experienced cryptek. How? Ahatek asked, returning his attention to the visual data feed flowing straight into his core matrices. The battle at the final gate, stopping the invaders from escaping into the greater hollow sun and disappearing into its vast, empty architecture, was only now ramping up. Unfortunate as it was, without a world mind, it was left to the crypteks under his command to rouse long-dormant weapons platforms and defensive installations. The energy was there, the hollow sun generated more power than it could ever use, even in the dynasty's heyday, but most of it went to waste, funneled into the Fostar surrounding the crown world. Rerouting a stream of power away from that and rousing long-dormant installations took time and effort, which they were all paying for. He felt the distinct shortage of crypteks at his command even more clearly than ever before, and even more so the true extent of the damage the mad Farian had done to the crown world in his brief moment of freedom. The hollow sun was crippled without a world mind. Unknown, Oscan replied, his ocular slowly settling into a steady, if dimmer glow. Suspected extraphysical Empyrean link between invading organisms. The prime organism was able to follow the link, teleporting into my sanctum when I took possession of one of the lesser organisms for study. Was that how that anomalous creature escaped the ghost wind? The transdimensional beamer hit it, and it worked. Ahatek was absolutely sure of that. Both of those initial invaders should have ended up in the ghost wind, stranded and exposed to the hordes of flayed ones who call that abominable dimension home. You subverted one of the canoptek wraiths to deposit the lesser organism in your sanctum? Ahatek asked after a long moment. The echoing space of the command deck fell silent, the Lich Guard standing behind their regent was as still as ever, but the cryptechs working tirelessly at data terminals in front of him paused. They remembered his distinct order to have both invaders banished to the ghost wind. Even Oskin paused, perhaps only now recognizing his blunder, which would mean he had to be in an even worse state than he portrayed. Oskin the codifier did not make mistakes. He wouldn't have served as the most trusted advisor to the Crimson Scythe for so long if he were in the habit of making mistakes. Ahateka's metallic finger tapped the armrest of his throne, the small clink echoing in the wide-open space. This wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. Oskin must have put studying the invader's biology as a higher priority than obeying his overlord regent. That was troubling, and nearly enough to finally push Ahatek over the edge. He was just barely managing to keep his apocalyptic rage contained, and then this happened. Oskin fell on his knees, barely catching himself on his staff from fully collapsing on the floor. The ancient cryptech bowed his head. "Forgive me, my Lord Regent. I merely endeavored to gather information on this new foe, not believing that it would remain stuck in the ghost wind for eternity. As evidenced, it escaped via Empyrean spatial tunneling from my dimensional sanctum. The ghost wind would not have held it for long, and it did not. As we have seen in this newest attempt, there are many lesser organisms bound to the primogenitor. If it didn't trace the link leading to my sanctum, it would have surely traced another link to escape." Oskin was truly fortunate because that was the exact same conclusion Ahatek had reached, and, while he would never admit it, he regretted not attempting to capture one of the creatures for further study. In retrospect, it was fortunate that he did not give the order to do so. This way, all blame for the failure fell on Oskin's shoulders. Still, going behind his back was not something to let go so easily, especially now when the numerous lords and overlords of the dynasty were looking at him for any sign of weakness. He'd already shown too much of that, but no more could be forgiven. The cryptech would need to be punished. But before that. "And did you learn anything of value?" Ahatek questioned. "Other than the Empyrean link, which serves as a reality tether to connect all these strange creatures," Oskin said, and Ahatek would have rolled his eyes if he could at the transparent attempt to remind him of that finding. As if that would save this fool from his wrath. "Hyperphase weapons are perfectly functional against them, and a tesseract labyrinth should be able to contain even the primogenitor organism, according to my analysis. However, said organism was greatly underselling its capabilities during the initial incursion, and I do not mean merely in its ability to spawn those lesser combat organisms. It moved faster, impossibly fast, and the Empyrean energy sensors in my sanctum nearly all detected a maximum density energy signature." Ahatek remained silent, musing over those words. The creatures in this new incursion were much easier to deal with than the pair that came here previously, or the first one that boarded his ship, but they were attacking a fortified position while the first Sol invader was just running away. According to the analytical reports, the first invader exhibited roughly equal physical properties and capabilities to those of a portion of the newest wave's combat organisms. Letting them escape into the hollow sun would be disastrous. He barely managed to catch a single one of those horrors in hours, and now there were hundreds, and he could see that there were actual organisms showing some capability for stealth, camouflage, and optical cloaking. Now, those would be a nightmare to hunt down and eliminate. "You will oversee the defenses and the elimination of these invaders," Oskin, Ahatek said. "Personally. Take 5 cryptechs of your choosing and eradicate these creatures. Capture them, if you wish, but I want them gone. Failure will not be tolerated." "As you say, my regent," Oskin replied, bowing his head slightly. "I will see to it that your will is done." Better have him act out in the open, where he could see him and be busy with an assigned task, than let the ancient cryptech work in the shadows. Ahatek did not like that he was unaware Oskin was interfering with the Canoptech race orders. He liked it much less than he dared to do so. For a lesser cryptech, he would have considered having them killed for the offense, even with his pressing need for manpower, but Oskin was the one, perhaps the only one, who could fix all the issues plaguing the hollow sun, given a few millennia. He couldn't afford to lose him. Oskin the codifier stepped out of the Eternity Gate, decked out in full war gear and followed by 4 of his foremost cryptech associates, all of them previous apprentices from eons past. Behind him was a veritable swarm of canoptech constructs, all bound to his and his 4 cryptechs' wills. He paused, slowly turning towards the lone figure standing next to the gate's exit, clearly having been waiting for Oskin's arrival. Up ahead, the battle was raging, a small corridor leading out onto a high-up balcony hidden from general view and shrouded behind an energy field. "What do you want, Rakaz?" Oskin addressed his fellow cryptech. If he held the most influence in the dynasty's royal court, then Rakaz, harbinger of eternity, the royal chronomancer of the Sabikar dynasty, was right behind him. The two of them had been rivals of sorts ever since the time of the War in Heaven, as 2 cryptechs from different conclaves tended to be when forced to occupy the same space repeatedly, though both had become deeply absorbed in their own work ever since the Great Awakening had begun. "You are not one to waste time by wishing me good fortune in a battle to come." "Correct," the royal chronomancer said simply, leaning on his sapphire-headed Ian stave. "I will be short. You walk into your doom, Oskin. That creature out there is a menace. Losing you would be highly detrimental to the dynasty, but the regent is being obtuse about this folly. This sector of the Hollow Sun must be purged in its entirety if we wish to beat back this incursion." "Beating back this incursion is not the problem, Chronomancer," Oskin said, straightening up as he started turning away from the ancient fool who liked to pretend he was omniscient. Perhaps the lesser cryptechs and the ignorant lords who knew nothing of the arcane mysteries of technosorcery were fooled, but Oskin was not. There was no such thing as omniscience, no matter what obnoxious, egotistical chronomancers liked to pretend since time immemorial. We must put an end to its source, and for that, the progenitor organism spawning these creatures must be captured and studied. It may not be the only one of its kind, after all. This one certainly doesn't seem to be either of the previous organisms that had infiltrated our crown world. If this incursion is beaten back, we must use the gained time to secure the crown world," Raka said, slamming the base of his Ian stave into the ground to drag Oskin's attention back onto him. "We must call for reinforcements from slumbering tomb worlds. It is foolish to let them remain asleep while the crown world is compromised, and I am not merely talking about this incursion, but of the horrid state of our hollow sun itself." "You are free to take your whining to the regent, Rakaz," Oskin said dismissively. "I have no time for it, nor the will to entertain your needless paranoia any longer. Either assist me in capturing this creature, or begone." In truth, the problem lay in the fact that the regent was paranoid about being overthrown in short order if he awoke an overlord in command of a numerically larger force than himself. Rightly so, in Oskin's opinion. Resourceful as Ahatek usually was, he was limited by the tools at his disposal and clearly floundering, trying to live up to Farian Amentek's mythical status. Which was impossible. That upstart would never be a new Crimson Scythe. But his paranoia served Oskin well. He certainly enjoyed the near-absolute lack of oversight over his activities stemming from the regent's lack of manpower. Besides, it wasn't like they even knew where exactly all the tomb worlds had ended up after 60 million years of stellar drift. The regent's most trusted underlings were scouring nearby systems for any sign of the long-lost tombs day after day. That was how the Sabikar became aware of other forces also seeking dormant tomb worlds. The vermin infesting this region of space knew that if the Sabikar dynasty rose once more, there would be nothing they could do but prostrate themselves before the Farian and beg for his mercy. "You are a fool, Oskin," Raka said, tapping his Ian stave on the ground. A simmering dimensional portal, hissing with etheric green energy at its edges, popped into existence behind the chronomancer, and he stepped through it. "When the time inevitably comes that you regret your folly, remember, I told you so. I will make sure you are remembered for all your failings for all eternity, should you die an ignoble death." With that final mocking sentence, the harbinger of eternity disappeared, making Oskin dismiss the errant thought stream that had begun contemplating testing some of his war gear on the egotistical nuisance. His metallic fingers tightened around his tremor stave, and he took a moment to banish the simmering rage back to the corners of his core matrices. He could deal with that upstart overabundant ego later. A rumble ran through the entire room, and an instant later, the shock wave reached Oskin's audio sensors. The sensor feed from the chamber bombarded him with alerts in the same instant, all but screaming about high-tier ordnance being employed, and the rapidly climbing levels of Empyrean energy radiation released by the hostile creatures. However, the alert that caught his eye was the one notifying him that 2 static monoliths were out of operation for the foreseeable future, and that the bulkhead was now 2 meters thinner within a few meter-wide circle. After a moment of hesitation, he broke into a sprint, rushing over to the hidden balcony and leaning over the ledge to take in the rapidly deteriorating situation with his own sensors. What he saw made him grip the railing until it bent under his fingers, his advanced processing capabilities instantly identifying the new organisms that had taken to the field as photyranids. With the Subakar dynasty's holdings being where they were, they'd been forced to contest what the humans have come to refer to as High Fleet Dagon, even if the devouring swarm of aliens largely left the lifeless slumbering tomb worlds alone. He'd made sure to acquire a human learned in the study of the many new alien species infesting the galaxy to spare himself the effort of having to study them each themselves. Of course, he couldn't trust the expertise of these so-called human Mugos biologists or inquisitors, but they were at the very least useful for pointing his own research towards prospective test subjects, even if he vowed to retrod the entire path of research from the start once his goals were fulfilled. Oftentimes, a faulty initial preconception could mislead an entire line of research, but he didn't have millennia to carefully examine every single species in the known galaxy. He swiftly identified the source of the problem, or rather, sources. Bioforms he could identify thanks to the knowledge extracted from a human Mugos biologist held his focus. Biovores, mobile artillery units, in great numbers, joined by exocrines, which were just massive bioplasma cannons on legs. Behind them were the more vexing creatures, the ones that his sensors told him were drenched in Empyrean power. Zoanthropes? No, these were slightly different. A memory tinged with great amusement popped back into his mind, of the tale the human Mugos told him of the doom of Malantai. These were neurothropes, creatures born of the progeny of the bioform that devoured the infinity circuit of an ancient craft world. Their most memorable ability was to siphon the life force of living beings to augment their Empyrean powers, which usually wouldn't be of much use against the unliving legions of the Necron, but these creatures were freely siphoning energy from their fellow photyranid bioforms. His exotic energy sensors were warning him that they were doing exactly that, presently pooling their Empyrean power together for a massive immaterial attack that they likely hoped would blow the bulkhead open like a battering ram. He did a round of calculations, then simulations, all in an instant and concluded that they would succeed if they could keep going for 15 minutes. Troublesome. It would seem he might be forced to use extreme measures after all. He would prefer to capture the progenitor organism, but the regent was correct in that letting them break through here would be disastrous. He just had to find a way to unleash a fraction of his secret weapon's power and focus it on the target. He didn't want to blow a hole into the side of the hollow sun, after all. He doubted his Farron would appreciate that when he finally came back to his senses. 316, codify this, you filthy casual. I watched the newcomers surge into the massive chamber, the swarm of canoptek spiders, scarabs, tomb stalkers, and tomb sentinels all scuttling over the walls while the race flocked around the 5 floating cryptex hovering high above the battlefield, carried by small anti-grav platforms. An energy field extending from the shrouded balcony they'd just leapt off of covered them, shielding them from immediate retaliation by my artillery bioforms. My curiosity got the better of me, and I watched as the lead cryptek, the one whom I immediately identified as the one I'd slapped into a wall, waved the oversized staff in his hand. A beam of iridescent light that shone in colors I couldn't name lashed out from its tip, slamming into the head of a neurothrope with no less power than what a devastator cannon could unleash. Expectably, the neurothrope's shields only held for an instant before they faltered and the creature that was little more than a floating, oversized brain in an armored casing burst apart into a shower of gore. I swiftly altered the network linking every synapse creature into my own off-brand version of a broodmind, and tightly controlled the rippling web of energy linking my neurothropes into a single weave of psychic power. The floating twat had instantly identified a crucial node to uphold the rest of the psychic network, and had I not been ready to fix the issue as it came up, the harmonized channeling might have come undone from that single attack. Exocrines and biovores across the field switched targets, half opening fire at the floating cryptex to test their protective force field and the rest targeting either the new swarm of canoptek constructs, prioritizing wraiths and sentinels, or laying into the section of the seemingly innocent wall I had seen the cryptex come from, and from where I could still sense the energy powering the force field around the cryptex to be coming from. Each impact created a crater the size of a hab block, and the artillery fire didn't abate for seconds, tearing chunk after chunk of the dark material making up the architecture without pause. The first sign that I was on the right track came when the Necrons, aside from the destroyers, all switched gears, swapping targets. My infantry and shock troops went largely ignored as a hail of unliving green beams rained down on my artillery bioforms, swiftly joined by the swarm of canoptech constructs falling upon them. Too bad for them, I'd channeled my own psychic power to reinforce the neurothrope psychic shielding for just long enough for them to finish casting their overcharged warp lance, powered by their combined psychic might. The immaterial lance of otherworldly energy lunged forward, powered not just by the soul energy I was willing to give it, but also from the neurothropes draining all my other drones of a substantial amount of their bioenergy. A locust heavy destroyer was all but vaporized as the warp lance went through it without slowing, but it was only the first of many caught in the blast before it slammed into the already present crater on the bulkhead. The wounded gate had just started the slow process of mending itself, but the warp lance burrowed into it deeply, vaporizing the material, making it up for meters upon meters. I felt it peter out less than 2 meters before fully breaking through to the other side. Note to self, expand my options and devote a shitload of processing power to developing a modular organic augmenter that would empower psychic attacks by siphoning bioenergy. Better yet, develop a bioenergy to soul energy converter based on how neurothropes work, if at all possible. Class 1 priority on the latter, Class 2 on the former. Put it on the to-do list. Acknowledged, my primary mind core responded, and I put that issue out of my mind for the moment. As expected, the cryptex lost their shit, despite having all but erased all my artillery bioforms from the battlefield. From their perspective, they had been too slow, and they could not allow any more of them to take to the field if they wanted to give the bulkhead time to do its necrodermis magic and mend itself. Unfortunately for them, my shock troops and regular combat drones had spent the time they wasted on targeting my artillery units, tearing apart weapon emplacements, automatic turrets, and a pair of faux carnifexes, even managed to yank a focusing crystal off the top of a monolith, leaving only a single particle whip in operation. On top of tearing through the distracted mass of immortals, of course, they might have been the least dangerous of my enemy's troops, but their Gauss weapons could still one-shot most of my drones if they got lucky and actually hit them. That would have made them an easy counter to the sluggish artillery bioforms, but I'd made sure all those had swarms of small flying drones surrounding them as chaff to eat up the green beams seeking to unmake them. On top of that, all my bigger drones had ablative armor ready to shed their surface layers one after another when struck by Gauss weapons, so even without the swarms, they could tank 1 or 2 shots before they became lethal. Half the canoptech race disappeared, fading out of existence like a bunch of heat mirages. It was only through me devoting an inordinate amount of processing power to workshopping new prototype spacetime sensors for catching beings lingering just halfway phased out of real space that I had the faintest of ideas about where they were going. I could have guessed, in retrospect. They were coming to murder the shit out of me in my little bunker. I was curious what they'd do, so I let them, sending a batch of my most promising stealth drones to crawl up the walls and hang above the cryptex, ready to drop down on their heads while a score of them also crawled up to the now revealed and demolished balcony. If I were lucky, they'd be able to take out whatever was generating that energy shield, and then the cryptex would have to deal with a sudden downpour of lictors and my personally designed assassin drones. The lead cryptech released a pulse of exotic energy from his stave, and the 4 other ones behind him did the same with their weird, obsidian-tipped staffs. The ground, dozens of meters down, quaked. Then a ripple ran through it as if the reinforced floor were the surface of a disturbed lake. Then a wave came, crashing through the chamber from end to end and throwing every combatant with their feet on the ground, the air, tumbling ass over ket, which unfortunately made them easy targets for the skulking deathmarks, and even the immortals got in a few dozen lucky shots at the temporarily immobilized drones. A moment later, a set of 8 obsidian pylons, notably not of the blackstone kind, rose across the chamber, rocky material tearing free of the walls, floor, pillars, statues, and other architectural elements to form the floating obelisks. They crackled with green arcs of energy cascading over their surfaces, and I sensed them siphoning some exotic energy from their surroundings, which they funneled up to the cryptex floating above. Obelisk nodes. I thought the name popped into my mind a moment after I'd first laid eyes on them. They were the tools of geomancers, the cryptex specializing in the techno-arcane field of study, the Imperium dubbed alchemy. My plans shifted to account for the fact that all cryptex I was seeing had just identified their specialization, thereby narrowing the list of tricks I had to worry about. The canoptech wraiths phased into existence inside my bunker, annoyingly bypassing my wards, barriers, and psychically infused chidness armor. It was fine, I would just keep altering them, optimizing, returning, reworking. My sensors had detected the dimensional disturbance of a phased-out wraith's presence, and if it was possible to sense them, I did see why it wouldn't be possible to stop them from phasing through my stuff. I just needed to work on it. Their scythes, bladed limbs, and long, serpentine tails ending in monomolecular blades lashed out, tearing through the soft insides of the decoy clones of myself I'd left out and about. The decoys all acted appropriately shocked and outraged at the ambush, and they exploded into action as one. Beads of eldritch flesh in their ribcages came alive, and tendrils tore free of the clones' bodies, not my smooth, ivory-white ones but miniature versions of the tendrils Tyranid bioships had on them. Some wraiths were quick enough to phase out and escape, most were not. Tendrils curled around them, and the metallic spines of the canoptech wraiths crunched like the pieces of scrap they were. Some activated transdimensional beamers, sending a clone or two into an extra-dimensional vacation, while others fired wildly with much less effective weapons. These things were made to maintain the tomb worlds while the Necrons slumbered. Their limbs and phase tech were meant to be used in fixing machinery without having to take it apart. It was no surprise they weren't exactly designed for combat or hit-and-run tactics. It must have been somewhat embarrassing for the Necrons that their next best assassin units after Deathmarks were literal maintenance robots. Then I made all my clones fall over, feigning death once their chest-burster alien tendrils came alive, which too grew slack after making all remaining wraiths in the dome inoperable. Okay then, it was showtime. I had gathered enough data on the effectiveness of previous stealth drone designs to construct a new prototype that would become the final piece I needed to go through with the plan I'd concocted. Of course, there was the chance of whatever trap, because there was sure to be one, was waiting for me on the other side of the bulkhead would blow my plan to smithereens, but what could I do but gamble and trust myself to get through it when the alternative was giving up? My little dome bunker collapsed inward, reforming into my avatar while the thick necrodermis dome surrounding it remained in place. I strode out through the opening, then leapt into action, drawing attention to myself by spawning a dozen new Draugr and faux Tyranid drones with each step. I moved faster than immortals could track, swifter than the searching beams could follow, and even the deathmarks couldn't quite hit me. The beams their weapons shot might have been terribly fast, but I was just as fast when I pushed myself, not that I needed to when I could dodge even before they pulled the triggers. Through my aura, I saw it all, and even if I didn't have a proper divination or warp-based danger sense, it certainly looked like I did from the outside. I leapt up, kicking off the ground and cratering it behind me as I shot off like a missile, inwardly grinning as I commanded my dutiful little stealth drones to go ham on that energy field generator they'd managed to dig out of the wall. The shield covering the cryptex vanished just as I reached it, and then I was upon them, weaving past the iridescent beam coming from the lead cryptech and lashing out with a vicious backhand powerful enough to pulverize his head even if it was made of pure fucking titanium. He vanished, like the slippery eel he was, reappearing a dozen meters away with his stave already aimed my way. A single note of an ethereal song rang out, and something rippled through space, expanding from one of the other cryptechs who held a strange object. It reached my avatar the instant it sounded out, and I felt something. I stretched the next nanosecond into a relative minute, running an in-depth analysis and diagnostics. The fucker had somehow compromised the structural integrity of every single cell in my body. The tougher it used to be, the softer it was now. My carapace armor might as well have been made of Play-Doh for all it was worth after that debuff hit me. Not that I cared, appearing next to the asshole who tried to dissect Celine again, even faster than before, soul and bioenergy burning through my body as eldritch flesh rebuilt my form from the ground up. One of my hands came down on the hand holding the tremor stave, shifting into a bones word that tore right through his metallic wrist. The other one snapped out, aiming to cut off his head. He disappeared again, though notably, his hand didn't regrow, nor was he able to recover his stave before it was snatched up by a gargoyle that promptly swallowed it, together with the hand still gripping it. I turned around, hand shifting into a massive bioplasma cannon thrice as large as the rest of my body combined, sourced from the exocrine template, and unleashed a point-blank pocket sun on the cunt trying to use his harp of dissonance on me again. My avatar wasn't cheap to make, and his earlier stunt cost me a whole bunch of bioenergy, so it filled me with glee to watch the Necron be reduced to a pile of molten slag raining down on my troops down below. Down on the ground, the floor quaked under the control of two of the cryptechs that had retreated from my fight, but that didn't stop my newly made artillery drones from finishing what their predecessors started and blowing apart the last of what remained of the bulkhead. I'd thought of slipping through the moment the path was open, but I was glad I didn't, as a Gauss beam nearly half a meter thick tore through the tunnel bored through the bulkhead and vaporized anything standing in its path. Then an energy shield came down on the other side of the bulkhead. Annoying, but not as much as the last standing monolith was when it finally fired, unleashing its particle whip at full force and tearing through the chamber with such force that by the time the beam of antimatter cut off, there was a chasm stretching across the chamber's floor. Of course, it erased a good bit of my drones as well in the process, and limited the paths my ground-bound troops could take to get to the bulkhead, forcing them through a small remaining section of the floor right in front of the monolith. A moment later, the massive eternity gate embedded into the monolith's face came alive, but instead of spitting out a new horde of Necrons for me to deal with, it sucked in anything and everything within a few dozen meters of it like a colossal vacuum cleaner. Some of my drones resisted, claws digging into the floor or latching onto pillars to resist the supernatural pull of what I only then recognized as a portal of exile, essentially a transdimensional beamer, turned into a portal with the suction force of a miniature black hole. Super neat, but really goddamned annoying. I spawned a dozen gargoyle drones, throwing a few at each of the cryptechs while I focused on their leader. I kicked off a hardened platform of air, flying at him like a missile while sharpening my senses, catching the moment his annoying emergency teleporter activated. There was a brief surge of exotic energy in a small device fixed to his metallic spine, hidden halfway by his ribcage. I kicked off a telekinetic platform again and flew at him, and without any visible hand motions, I reached out, my telekinetic grasp gripping that tool until it turned into scrap. The cryptech barely had time to put his stave between me and his body when he noticed his sudden lack of a failsafe, and even then, he was sent flying off like a metallic rocket, crashing into a pillar, bouncing off of it and spinning through the air wildly before he hit the floor, skipping across it like a rubber ball to bleed off momentum. I slammed into the floor where he landed not a moment later, and before he could reorient himself, my arm once more shifted into a bioplasma cannon. The floor surged up to form a shield above his prone, broken body and met the discharged plasma, but it wasn't enough. Some of it splattered across its surface, sent flying off in every direction in thick rivulets, but some bored through the geomantic shield and fell upon the cryptech. He didn't scream, Necrons didn't do that, but the parts of his body struck by the plasma grew white-hot, turning into molten slag. The Destroyer Lord, flanked by a dozen of his maddened kin, was charging at me, and I was forced to dodge around, which was made even worse when the head cryptech's one working arm was suddenly gripping a small pistol aimed my way. I made the snap decision then and there to go through with my plan, and a dozen new Draugr exploded from my avatar, leaping at the destroyers. Among them was a single stealth drone, the newest prototype design created based on my previous testing, using all the cloaking techniques that the data proved worked best against Necron's sensors. Inside it was my soulbone skeleton, and in a blink, I made it my new avatar, turning the previous body I'd just departed into a decoy. The cryptech's pistol fired, a beam of familiar antimatter particles leaping forth from its barrel and tearing into the space where my avatar used to be. My decoy drone leapt at him, all but tackling the cryptech as it struggled. The antimatter pistol fired again, blowing a basketball-sized hole through my avatar's flank, and a moment later, a beam of green energy slammed into its back, which was when I activated the self-destruction command on the decoy. A cataclysmic explosion shook the chamber, erasing the head cryptech, the Destroyer Lord and two heavy destroyers along with numerous other lesser Necrons. Pillars collapsed, the walls quaked, and the shockwave made even the bulkhead shudder. When the energy shield at the end of the tunnel I'd made through it split open for a moment, the massive Gauss weapon waiting just for that fired as expected, erasing a dozen neurothropes and lictors from existence, but it was too slow to catch a single invisible, untraceable creature from slipping through. A quick telepathic order swept through the pseudo-bird mind as my new avatar disappeared into a dark tunnel, and a moment later, a deep rumble ran through this section of the hollow sun. In the chamber I'd just escaped from, every single remaining drone of mine ignited every last lick of their bioenergy, devouring their own biomass to boost the power of the explosion caused by their self-destruction countermeasures, activating all at once. If any sensor might have caught even a whiff of me slipping away, I was sure the explosion would have taken care of that problem neatly. Alrighty then, one target down, 2 more to go. Then I'll have to figure out how to actually subvert this oversized space station masquerading as a sun for myself.